Chapter 495. However, the fall of the fortress was only the first step. Gao Chuanjun quickly rushed to the entrance of the tunnel. He frowned and thought for a moment. Then, he found some soldiers who were still energetic and began to dig the ground. After 2 hours, they finally cleared out all the sand, revealing a dark and endless tunnel. Gao Chuanjun's face showed a little joy. The joy on Gao Chuanjun's face didn't last long. He calmly sent a group of soldiers down to explore the tunnel. He also told them that no matter if they met Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers, they should send someone back to report every half an hour. However, after several groups of people went down, not a single person came back to report. This made Gao Chuanjun's heart turn cold. Because he didn't even hear the sound of fighting. In addition, he sent 3,000 to 4,000 people. It was impossible for them to not even have a chance to retreat before being wiped out by Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers. Then, the only possibility was that there was something wrong with this tunnel. After reorganizing his thoughts, Gao Chuanjun chased away the joy of victory from his mind. He did indeed remember some rumors about Lei Qiusheng when he was building this fortress that was known as impregnable. At the beginning of the construction, the designer had built many secret tunnels filled with traps in Wei River City. Unless one had the original blueprints, one might die from the traps if they entered the tunnels. Even if one's cultivation was high enough that the traps couldn't do anything to them, it was easy to get lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. After that, in order to keep it a secret, even the designer was secretly executed by Lei Qiusheng. Only Shenlin Jun's generals and temporary commanders knew the structure of the tunnels. These people were basically going to serve Shenlin Jun for life until they died of old age. Their purpose was to ensure the absolute safety of this tunnel. After thinking this through, Gao Chuanjun could only bitterly laugh twice and accept the fact that he didn't want to accept. There was no way to break this tunnel. Either he got the blueprint or he could only leave it alone. In this battle, nearly 100,000 Shenlin Jun's reserve troops were annihilated. However, after the rest of the troops escaped into the underground tunnel, even a general like Gao Buzhan who had been through hundreds of battles couldn't help but hesitate. He didn't even know how to face Lin Yuan. After all, they didn't know how long these tunnels were, how many changes there were, and where the exit at the other end of the tunnels was. Moreover, after losing 3,000 to 4,000 men, Gao Jiezhen didn't dare to take any more risks with his brothers. The only thing they could be sure of was that no matter how long this tunnel was, it couldn't go all the way to the Central Plains. After all, they didn't know how deep the Wei River was, and it was impossible for them to go around it. If they really dug such a deep tunnel, it wouldn't be able to provide enough support, and it could collapse at any time. At that time, not only would they not be able to protect the tunnel, even the fortress above ground would be destroyed together with it. Therefore, it was impossible for these Shenlin Jun's reserve troops to return to the Central Plains. They could only go to different places in the north through different secret tunnels, and then become a nail that was nailed into the palm of the northern frontier. Although Gao Jiezhen already knew that he couldn't do his best in this battle, the two sides were in a deadlock here. Compared to the Shenlin Jun's reserve troops escaping from under his nose, it was two different things. The former was just a lack of troops and siege equipment, but the latter was tantamount to pointing at his nose and calling him a piece of trash. Gao Jiezhen, who was helpless, could only secretly spit and curse. They claimed to be invincible, but in the end, they dug so many rat holes in the ground. They want to be a whore and set up a monument to their chastity. It doesn't matter. They're just a group of defeated soldiers. At most, they'll be disgusting, but they won't be a big problem. Lin Yuan, who walked in from outside the city, comforted Gao Jiezhen and said with a chuckle, "Old Gao, I'll leave the construction of the defense line along the river to you. You must come up with your first plan within 3 days. This is your chance to become famous in the northern frontier. Although Li Zhong and the others will definitely raise objections, if you can make it perfect and pass it with a unanimous vote, then the impact on your future will definitely be different from the subsequent plans that need to be modified and pieced together." Hearing Lin Yuan's words, Gao Jiezhen's face also turned red, which was rare. Although he was ostracized in the Shenwu dynasty for decades, this didn't mean that Gao Jiezhen didn't care about fame. If that was the case, then why did he join the Fallen Star Army in the first place? Why did he have to risk his life to become a champion? Yan Xingqi had been exiled in the northern frontier for decades. Although his old subordinates still respected him, his prestige was not as high as before. Otherwise, under Yan Xingqi's call, there would be more than just Gao Jiazhen and his 5,000 old brothers who came to the northern frontier to join Lin Yuan. What really attracted Gao Jiazhen was the talent selection system of the northern frontier. In the northern frontier, one's background, wealth, status, and even reputation didn't matter much. If one wanted to become a real person in the northern frontier, then one needed to have enough ability. As a former champion, Gao Jiazhen was confident that he could occupy a place in the northern frontier military. However, after the establishment of the Northern Frontier Academy, Gao Jiazhen saw many talents in the field of military studies. This made him worry about his future position. His only advantage now was that he had rich experience on the battlefield. Moreover, he didn't need to study those basic courses on the battlefield to be able to directly enter the battlefield. If he couldn't establish his own authority now, then when the northern frontier was filled with bright stars in the future, he wouldn't have much room to do. And now, the defense line along the river was bound to become the first battlefield against the main forces of the Xinwu dynasty. Whether or not the northern frontier could withstand the first round of the Xinwu dynasty's counterattack would depend on how far-sighted this defense line plan was. Whether or not it could make the generals of the Xinwu dynasty rack their brains to think of a way to defeat them. As long as they could withstand the first round of the Xinwu dynasty's counterattack, even if the defense line was destroyed in the following tug-of-war, Gao Jiazhen could rely on this contribution to become one of the future generals of the northern frontier. Moreover, it would be an extremely dazzling one. It would definitely be more valuable than a champion in name only. Moreover, this defense line not only had to be impenetrable, but it also had to be exquisitely designed and inexpensive. Otherwise, with the financial resources of the northern frontier, if they wanted to carry out the Great Wall plan and the defense line along the river at the same time, there was no doubt that they would be unable to make ends meet. It was even possible that next year's financial resources would be overdrawn to the point of a deficit. Gao Jiazhen dismounted from his horse and knelt in front of Lin Yuan on one knee. He clasped his fist and said, "This subordinate is not talented. I can only repay the Dragon King with my life." Chapter 496. Apart from the brief interlude in Wei River City, the entire northern battlefield had entered a white-hot zone. The Yao beasts and demi-human warriors hiding in the forest taught the Frost Mirror barbarians a good lesson. For the first time, the Frost Mirror barbarians personally experienced that war wasn't as simple as being completely annihilated by the other side or completely annihilated by the other side. Under the command of the graduates of the Northern Frontier Academy, the demi-human army methodically divided the Frost Mirror barbarian army into pieces of meat that made them drool. Then, taking advantage of the terrain where the enemy's warhorses weren't suitable for charging in the mountains and forests, as well as the overwhelming advantage of the northern frontier's armaments, the demi-human army slowly devoured the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers who dared to enter the mountains and forests. After losing nearly 200,000 soldiers, the Frost Mirror barbarian commanders also learned of the strategy of "don't enter the forest." They didn't give the northern frontier a chance to divide and tear them apart, and took the initiative to disperse their forces and occupy the plains. In this way, the northern frontier army's lack of training was highlighted, and the quality of the soldiers was uneven. After all, in a large battle, your fellow soldiers and comrades would give you a chance to fill in the gaps. But in a small-scale battle, everyone couldn't even take care of themselves. Who would have the time to clean up your mess? However, the setback on the northern frontier was within everyone's expectations, and they didn't fall into a disappointing situation. They changed their previous aggressive attitude and concentrated their forces in the mountains and forests, or stationed them in places that the army had to pass through. In any case, they didn't continue to engage in small-scale battles with the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers. This made the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers suffer, because their primary mission in the northern frontier wasn't to suppress the northern frontier, but to find the 13th prince. The 13th prince was the Frost Mirror Khan's favorite son, and he was even called Badu, on the grassland, which meant the warrior of the grassland. In the Frost Mirror grassland where power determined status, having such a son ensured that Shuang Jihan would be able to protect his Shuiliao tribe from being swallowed up by other tribes even if he was pulled down from the throne of Great Khan by other tribes. After all, the 13th Prince's Shuiliao cavalry was a tough nut to crack. Anyone who wanted to chew on them would have to grind their teeth off. Those tribes wanted to preserve their strength, so they naturally wouldn't engage in a bloody battle with the Shuiliao tribe. But now, they were trapped in the northern plains, unable to advance even half a step. Moreover, they did not know what was happening behind them. Even their supply line had been cut off by the Northern Frontier Army. Until now, not a single grain of rice had been sent in. Seeing that their rations were about to run out, they had no choice but to kill extra warhorses to satisfy their hunger. But where would they find extra warhorses? The Shuangjin barbarian soldiers could only kill the exhausted warhorses and replace their mounts with the other 2 warhorses that had not ridden into the northern frontier. This was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst, because if they didn't change their mounts, the most fatal problem for the cavalry would be their stamina problem. Originally, they could still plunder the cities in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong's strategy of erecting walls and clearing the wilderness left only a few troops disguised as Shenwu dynasty soldiers in the northern frontier. There was only a small amount of rations left, and it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. These soldiers who stayed behind to guard the northern frontier were basically doing it voluntarily. Their bravery was unparalleled, so it wasn't easy to chew on a hard bone, and even if they did, they wouldn't be full. After a few losses, they gave up on those cities. They didn't even know what to do with the captives they caught. It would be a waste to kill them. After all, although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were good at fighting in the wilderness, they were not good at sieging cities. They didn't know that the northern frontier had removed the city walls, so they naturally had to keep a certain number of cannon fodder and slaves to prepare for a war of attrition against the cities of the northern frontier. It was exactly the same strategy as the beast tied when attacking human cities. Therefore, it wasn't unreasonable for them to be called barbarians. Apart from looking like humans, they were almost no different from monsters in the eyes of the other 6 great empires. But if they kept these people alive, they would have more food to feed. If this went on, they might even eat humans with bloodshot eyes. Before these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers entered the northern frontier, they naturally didn't know that the aristocratic families and sects in the northern frontier had already been wiped out by Li Zhongsheng. Under the operation of the embroidered uniform guards, all the wealth accumulated by those aristocratic families had been swallowed up by Lin Yuan. As long as the people in the cities were evacuated, the entire northern frontier would instantly become a battlefield. Without the obstruction of the aristocratic families and sects, this step was particularly easy. After all, no one wanted to live on the battlefield. There was no guarantee that they would lose their lives at any time. The supplies were transported by the supply caravans, and the routes of the supply caravans were basically in the mountains or places where there were large numbers of soldiers. With just these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers, it was impossible for them to steal anything without paying a heavy price. Moreover, several times before they succeeded, the soldiers of the northern frontier actually set fire to the caravans and even fought directly on the burning caravans. In the end, the soldiers and the caravans were burned to ashes together. They didn't give them any supplies at all. In particular, these supply caravans were all from the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. These guys who had been traveling in the Hengduan Mountains all year round were not to be trifled with. They had to be on guard at all times against demonic beasts or other forces in the northern frontier. Their fighting ability in the mountains and plains was not much worse than the demi-human army and demonic beasts. They were the toughest of the toughest. After all, the 13th prince had been lost in the northern frontier. Now, even the main forces of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were having such a hard time, let alone the 13th prince, who they had lost contact with for a long time. At this moment, most of the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers believed that the 13th prince, who had lost contact with the Frost Mirror grassland, had most likely died at the hands of the people of the northern frontier. Even the Bloodridge Knights who were originally from the Bloodridge tribe didn't believe that the 13th prince was still alive. After this period of fighting, the people of the northern frontier were fiercer and more barbaric than the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers. Many of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were even thinking of retreating. They felt that it was useless to continue staying in the northern frontier. It was better for them to go back and recuperate. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were allocated with 3 horses per person, they couldn't eat all of them. Although the people of the grassland knew how to fight, if they wanted to cross the Frost Mirror grassland on foot without horses, it was no different from suicide. The Shuangjin barbarian soldiers were gloomy. They even began to secretly complain about their ally, the Shinwu dynasty. After all, they had agreed to it on the surface. Until now, the Shinwu dynasty had not sent a single soldier to put pressure on the northern frontier. Otherwise, the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers would never have fallen to such a miserable state. Chapter 497. The war gradually reached its climax, but the Shinwu dynasty still didn't make a move. It wasn't that they didn't want to take this opportunity to attack the northern frontier, but the Frost Mirror barbarian troops entering the central plains were like fish entering water. Fighting cavalry in the endless plains was undoubtedly foolish. Thus, the Shinwu dynasty's army could only choose to retreat and defend the cities, leaving large areas of wilderness and villages to the Frost Mirror barbarian troops. However, even though most of the cities in the central plains were much more prosperous than the small cities in the north, their defensive capabilities couldn't be compared. They couldn't withstand the attacks of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Frost Mirror barbarian troops. Almost every now and then, news of a city falling would reach the imperial capital. A group of aristocratic family heads, sect disciples, and nobles were all cowering in the temporarily safe imperial capital, trembling in fear. Although the Shinwu dynasty's imperial capital seemed to be absolutely safe for the time being, even the monarch, Lei Qiusheng, was aware of the problem. As the instigators, how could they not know how much the imperial army in charge of protecting the imperial capital had been corrupted by them? It would be safer for them to go up and fight against the ferocious Shuangjin barbarian troops rather than rely on those young masters to climb up the city walls and fight against the ferocious Shuangjin barbarian troops. In an instant, the entire imperial capital was covered in a gloomy cloud of gloom. According to the style of these aristocratic families, they didn't care about anything other than their own land. If not for the fact that Lei Qiusheng was a powerful and tyrannical monarch, some people would have already begun to force Lei Qiusheng to give up large amounts of territory and recall the border troops to resist the Shuangjin barbarian troops. As for the consequences of doing so, they didn't care and didn't want to care. In any case, dying a few years later was better than dying now. I wonder what the situation is like in the north. A commander of the Blood Liao cavalry carefully wiped his blood-stained scimitar clean on an animal skin before slowly sheathing it. Behind him were countless ferocious Blood Liao knights, as well as an even larger number of disheveled, and demoralized slave soldiers. In front of them was a burning city. Judging from the tall and wide walls, this city definitely had a high status in the Central Plains. However, not only did this rich city fail to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' advance, it only served to increase their desire to plunder. After all, even though the Shinwu dynasty might not be as rich as the entire Shuangjin dynasty, a city in the Shinwu dynasty was definitely richer than a tribe in the Frost Mirror Prairie. Even the Frost Mirror Khan's Blood Liao tribe was no exception. These Frost Mirror barbarian who had entered the Central Plains were living a much better life than their compatriots in the north. They ate until their mouths were full of oil, and they continued to collect large amounts of wealth. Once the higher-ups gave the order to retreat, they could leave at any time. With the wealth they plundered, they could at least raise the strength of the entire tribe by 2 levels. In addition, the public opinion that Lin Yuan had carefully created also exploded at this moment. Almost all the people believed that the border army had already been defeated. Otherwise, it would be impossible for so many barbarians from the northern frontier to enter the Central Plains. Many people didn't even wait for the Frost Mirror barbarian to continue moving south. They had already spontaneously started migrating further south. This move was absolutely fatal to the current Shinwu dynasty. The north was already out of control, and the south was in endless chaos. If even the people in the Central Plains fled, it would mean that the Shinwu dynasty wouldn't receive a single grain tax in the coming year. Apart from shamelessly asking for peace with Lin Yuan and acknowledging his control over the north, they could only earn resources through the sea trade route in the south. Otherwise, they would all have nothing to eat next year. Lei Qiusheng had no choice but to order officials at all levels to appease the people. At the same time, the border army in the north was on full alert to resist the Shuangjin barbarian reinforcements with all their might. The situation in the Central Plains was indeed stabilized in a short period of time. At the very least, the number of Frost Mirror barbarian troops no longer increased. After the supply line was cut off, they were no longer as difficult to deal with as before. With the garrisons in each city, they could still hold on for a while. At the very least, the situation in the Central Plains would not happen again. But at the same time, they had also blocked the Frost Mirror barbarians' path to invade the northern frontier. This immediately reduced the pressure on the northern frontier. And the Frost Mirror barbarian invaders were right to complain about their allies, because it was the Shenwu dynasty that had cut off their supply line. There was no other way. After all, the place where the barbarians invaded was the source of the Wei River. If the defense line in the north remained open, these barbarians could cross the Wei River and enter the Central Plains at any time. Therefore, if they wanted to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' attack, they couldn't leave any openings. This time, it could be said that Lei Qiusheng had shot himself in the foot. Not only did he not cause the northern region to be unable to recover from this setback, but he had also suffered enough. Every day, he had a sickly look on his face and did not even attend court if he could. After all, once the officials gathered, there would always be an imperial censor who would come out to question him. Why were the 700,000 Frost Mirror barbarian able to bypass the border army's defenses and plunder the Central Plains? Why did the Shenwu dynasty suffer such heavy losses? Why didn't they send out a decent army to win 2 battles to vent their anger? Of course, Lei Qiusheng wouldn't say that this was a plan he had prepared to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, he could let the Frost Mirror barbarian invade the north and delay Lin Yuan's annexation of the north. This would give him enough time to pacify the south or mobilize his troops to fight the northern frontier. In addition, Lei Qiusheng had previously used his connections to transfer a group of Blood Liao knights into the northern frontier. It was as if a knife was hanging over his head. He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to reorganize the northern defense line and get rid of all the generals who were close to Lei Qiusheng in one fell swoop before replacing them with trusted subordinates. But he didn't expect the Shuangjin barbarian to do this repeatedly. Not only did he want to attack the north, he didn't even let off his ally. After all, Lei Qiusheng couldn't announce that all this was because of his own mistakes, could he? In that case, how could he still be the emperor? Moreover, as a political expert, Lei Qiusheng could naturally see the real side of the matter from the layers of appearances. For example, the seemingly sharp questions of the imperial censor were actually just a prelude. Once the time was right, those aristocratic families would force him to cede a large amount of land to the Shuangjin dynasty and the Qingjiang dynasty in exchange for peace. Anyway, the one who would lose was the Shenwu dynasty, not the aristocratic families. Now that the Shenwu dynasty was in danger, if they continued to support Lei Qiusheng to fight on 2 fronts, and at the same time become enemies with the northern frontier, the inheritance of the aristocratic families that had been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years would be destroyed in their hands. Of course, after this main goal was achieved, they would propose to withdraw the troops in various regions. It seemed that they wanted to reduce the expenditure of the national treasury, but in fact, they wanted Lei Qiusheng to disperse his cultivation and gradually lose the ability to suppress the aristocratic family's troops. Chapter 498. This was the main reason why Lei Qiusheng detested the aristocratic families. Lin Yuan was thinking of ways to eliminate different voices at the northern frontier. However, within the Shenwu dynasty, various factions were thinking of ways to weaken Lei Qiusheng's power. They didn't seek to pull Lei Qiusheng down from the throne, but at least they wanted to prevent Lei Qiusheng from killing them as he wished. Of course, people were greedy and insatiable. Once they weakened Lei Qiusheng's power step by step, the next thing they would do would be to covet the sacred artifacts and experience the feeling of taking turns to be the emperor. Lei Qiusheng was even a little envious of Lin Yuan. Although the northern frontier wasn't big, after a series of purges and suppression, the entire northern frontier was under Lin Yuan's control. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought for as long as he wanted. No one dared to say anything. This was because the aristocratic families in the northern frontier were relying on Lin Yuan to survive. Once Lin Yuan fell from power, the entire northern frontier would be weakened and destroyed. This kind of method of attaching an entire force to a single person was extremely stupid. Once there was no outstanding successor, then the speed of the force's growth would be the same as the speed of its collapse. Lei Qiusheng knew that this method was stupid, but he still dreamed of becoming such an emperor. However, he was helpless. Back then, he was able to ascend to the throne by relying on his military power. However, with the abilities of those big shots, it was impossible for them to govern the region. Therefore, he could only use a large number of talents from the aristocratic families and sections. This resulted in the current situation where he couldn't get rid of his subordinates. Zhang Xiu, Lei Qiusheng, who was pacing back and forth in Yangxin Palace Hall, subconsciously called out. However, a trace of sadness quickly appeared on Lei Qiusheng's face. That person was no longer here. Actually, putting aside the fact that he was a surviving member of the Zhao clan, Zhang Xiu had done his best under Lei Qiusheng. He had managed the embroidered guard from nothing to a ferocious tiger that everyone feared. Although it couldn't be separated from Lei Qiusheng's great support behind him, it was enough to show that Zhang Xiu wasn't an embroidered pillow like Lin Yuan had described him to be. On the contrary, Zhang Xiu was a great talent with real talent. Moreover, after decades of getting along with each other, the stubborn Lei Qiusheng had also treated Zhang Xiu as one of his few friends. Although they were not as close as Shadow, who had grown up together, they were still closer than Lei Qiusheng. Now that there was a problem with the war strategy, Lei Qiusheng sadly discovered that he couldn't even find someone to discuss it with. After a while, Lei Qiusheng walked out of Yangxin Palace Hall with bloodshot eyes and strode to the yamen of the Servants' Administration. Greetings, Your Majesty. The Servants' Administration wasn't just one of the two intelligence agencies in Lei Qiusheng's hands. It was also a place that trained eunuchs and palace maids to serve the imperial family, nobles, and even high-ranking officials. For people born in this place, they had to remember the faces of even the students who had passed the imperial examinations but hadn't had the chance to be promoted. How could they be blind when facing Lei Qiusheng, the ruler of a country? Lei Qiusheng waved his hand, indicating for the eunuchs and palace maids to stand up. At the same time, he asked, "Where is my Shenlin Jun now? How long will it take for him to return?" However, the response to Lei Qiusheng was a deathly silence. Suddenly, Lei Qiusheng's heart skipped a beat. There was even a hint of panic on his face. As his trump card, Shenlin Jun's importance to him was self-evident. If something happened to Shenlin Jun, not to mention the covetous eyes of the two empires, even Lin Yuan could step on his head and abuse his power. Speak! Lei Qiusheng fiercely stomped his foot, shattering a white jade tile as he roared in annoyance. An old eunuch with snow-white hair trembled as he knelt on the ground. He said bitterly, "Your Majesty, after Shenlin Jun received Your Majesty's decree, he was stopped by Eunuch Tai before he could leave. I'm afraid he won't be able to return in a short period of time." Hearing that his shadow had left Shenlin Jun in the south at such a time of crisis, Lei Qiusheng's face didn't reveal any strange expression. However, his heart grew heavier and heavier. This was because the shadow's action meant that there was an even bigger mess in the south. It was no longer a problem that could be solved by killing Lei Qiusheng or wiping out a few aristocratic families. The old eunuch quietly raised his head. When he saw that Lei Qiusheng hadn't delivered the goods, he lowered his head again and said, "According to the news that Eunuch Tai sent a while ago, those evil cultists who were banished overseas have now returned to the south to preach. Currently, a large number of people have already joined them. Eunuch Tai said that there are countless rebel armies in the south. There is no army that can be trusted. Only Shenlin Jun, who is loyal to Your Majesty to the death, can take on this great responsibility and eliminate those evil cultists." Evil. Teach. Disciple. The moment these three words appeared, Lei Qiusheng only felt that his brain had exploded with a buzzing sound. His vision instantly turned white. As the actual ruler of the Shenwu dynasty, he knew too many secrets that others didn't know. He was very clear that the top forces who called themselves the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates were mortal enemies with these evil cultists. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that both sides had an irreconcilable hatred. They definitely wouldn't sit by and watch the evil cultists develop and grow stronger in the south. They wouldn't even let them enter the south. But now, not only had the evil cultists entered the south, they had even started to preach in the south. No one had come out to control them. Even the shadow had no choice but to disobey Lei Qiusheng's orders and intercept Shenlin Jun. He was prepared to let them take on the responsibility of eliminating the evil cultists at any time. However, the attitude of the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates had already explained many things. Since they could tolerate the evil cultists preaching in the south, it meant that they were willing to make almost any concessions other than directly sending troops to suppress the Shenwu dynasty. Lei Qiusheng opened his mouth and laughed bitterly. The sound coming from his throat was like a broken bellows. Your Majesty, the old eunuch raised his head with a worried expression. He looked at Lei Qiusheng, who had changed his usual shrewd style. He felt as if he was being chased, and his heart was tightly clenched. After all, these eunuchs grew up and learned in the palace. Their loyalty to Lei Qiusheng was definitely no less than that of Shenlin Jun. It might even surpass that of Shenlin Jun. After all, Shenlin Jun was a professional soldier. He could still live well without Lei Qiusheng. Even if he retired and went to a remote city to be a demon slayer or a mercenary, he could still live a good life. However, these eunuchs were different. Without Lei Qiusheng, they were just a group of lonely disabled people with no one to rely on. Even if their cultivation was high and their wealth was comparable to that of a country, they would still end up with no one to send them off in their old age. Their power, their lives, and even their everything were linked to Lei Qiusheng. Naturally, they had to think about Lei Qiusheng at all times. Chapter 499. This humble one is doing very well. Lei Qiusheng finally regained some clarity after hearing the old eunuch's call. However, he felt an inexplicable sadness in his heart. No matter how he viewed himself, the current rotten situation had become a mess that was difficult for him to clean up. This was especially true after Lin Yuan revealed his ambitions. Lei Qiusheng was in a state of panic and had taken many remedial measures. However, the more he did, the more mistakes he made, which led to the current situation. Even though Lei Qiusheng knew that as long as he had enough time to deal with the south, even if Lin Yuan completely took over the north, he would still have the strength to fight. However, the enormous pressure that had been accumulating in his heart day after day made Lei Qiusheng, blinded by greed, choose to open the border. He gritted his teeth and let the Frost Mirror barbarian into the country, but he didn't expect that he would shoot himself in the foot. His originally resentful attitude completely changed after hearing the news of the southern evil cultists. He originally only treated Lin Yuan as an equal opponent, but he didn't expect that Lin Yuan's plans were even greater than his. The cultists had even bypassed him and directly contacted the most powerful forces. If the shadow had not happened to be in the south, it was likely that the cultists would have caused a huge ruckus before the report would appear on the shadow's desk. Because at this moment, Lei Qiusheng clearly understood that it wasn't just Lin Yuan. Even the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the top-level factions, all thought of him as the loser before the war even began. None of you are optimistic about this humble one's chances? This humble one is going to win this war no matter what. Lei Qiusheng suddenly took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Eunuch Shua, this humble one doesn't have any trustworthy people by his side right now. I can only trouble the servants' administration to make a trip to the northern border. Have the troops there withdraw in batches to the central plains and defend the imperial capital to the death. Without this humble one's orders, no one is allowed to fight on their own. Those who disobey will have their entire family executed. The old eunuch called Eunuch Zhua was shaken. He looked at Lei Qiusheng in disbelief, as if this was the first time he had met this person. I am very clear-headed now. I know the consequences of doing so. Lei Qiusheng gritted his teeth and fiercely said, "Didn't they look down on me? They want this humble one's beautiful country, but this humble one will not give it to them. Even if they are lucky enough to beat this humble one this time, this humble one will leave them with a terrible mess." Yes. Eunuch Zhuo lowered his head again and pressed his forehead against the ground, trying to control his emotions. He wasn't sure what Lei Qiusheng was feeling right now, but he was sure that Lei Qiusheng wasn't clear-headed at the moment. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a decision that harmed others without benefiting himself. He wouldn't have chosen to give up on all his plans at this time. However, Eunuch Zhuo did not have Eunuch Tai's cultivation, nor did he have Zhang Xiu's forbearance, nor did he have Li Zhong's wisdom. He was just a loyal official, a foolish loyal official. Thus, even though he knew that Lei Qiusheng's decision was wrong, Eunuch Zhuo did not speak up to dissuade him. On the Frost Mirror grassland far away from the Shenwu dynasty, in the royal tent of the Shuiliao tribe, a man who seemed to be in his 30s was holding a book in his left hand and a white stone in his right. His brows were furrowed as he sat in the tent in deep thought. But he was the only person in the tent. No one knew who he was playing Go with, or what he was thinking about. The man's skin was white and delicate, as smooth as milk. He didn't seem like a child of the grassland who had been tempered by the sun and wind day and night. Instead, he seemed like one of those scholarly Confucian disciples from the south of the Shenwu dynasty. He even wore a moon-white brocade robe, the style of which had been popular in the Shenwu dynasty last year. However, the material used was even more luxurious and expensive than the vast majority of high-class cloth shops. One could tell at a glance that it was no ordinary item. Even more inconceivable was that the book in the man's hand was not some incomprehensible Go manual, nor was it a Confucian classic. Instead, it was a book that could be seen everywhere on the northern frontier and that no one dared to disobey, the new laws of the northern frontier. Third Prince, the Blood Eagle has sent back a message. A Frost Mirror barbarian wearing a leather coat and iron armor placed a stack of parchment in front of the man. Without waiting for him to speak, the Frost Mirror barbarian cupped his fists and left the tent. The man acted as if he hadn't heard anything. His brows were still furrowed as he pondered for an incense stick's worth of time. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he gently placed the white stone in his hand on the chessboard. The entire chessboard instantly came to life. The white stone that had been in a disadvantageous position suddenly twisted and turned into a killing move. At this point, the man finally put down the book in his hand. He stood up and walked to a copper basin to wash his hands with water. Then, he used a piece of dry animal skin to wipe the water off his hands. Only then did he return to his soft couch and sit down. He picked up the stack of parchment and began to read. It wasn't until he finished reading the last parchment that the man slowly exhaled and murmured, "He's gone mad." The Blood Eagle was an intelligence agency that he had set up himself. However, Frost Mirror Barbarian wasn't good at intelligence. Even if he disguised himself, his skin and demeanor were completely different from those who lived in a world where birds sang and flowers bloomed. Therefore, there were very few secret agents and spies in the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if there were a few similar organizations, they were short-lived. They were either destroyed in an instant or slowly fell into a useless state. Even though his Blood Eagle could hide in the Shenwu dynasty, it still couldn't obtain first-hand information. This was also the reason why he could slowly think of a way to solve the chessboard after receiving the information about the Shenwu dynasty. However, based on this outdated information, he could draw several conclusions. Firstly, his valiant 13th brother was already confirmed dead. Second, the strength of the northern frontier was far beyond their imagination. It was estimated that none of the people who entered the north this time could come out. Third, Lei Qiusheng had gone mad. The first two pieces of information were already speculated by him. Even if they were confirmed now, they weren't worth mentioning. However, the last piece of information made him cautious. In addition to the information he received this morning, Lei Qiusheng was going to withdraw the border army in the north and let them directly enter the rich and livable hinterland of the Shenwu dynasty to occupy territory and plunder treasures. In other words, Lei Qiusheng was going to use the entire Shuangjin dynasty as a knife and let them be the executioners whose hands were stained with blood. For Lei Qiusheng would get rid of all the major problems and directly reshuffle the power structure of the entire Shenwu dynasty. But what if he's not mad? The third prince's eyebrows, which had just relaxed, were tightly knitted together again. His expression was a little uncertain. He dared to use the Shuangjin dynasty as a knife. Wasn't he afraid that it was easier to invite the devil than to send the devil away? Chapter 500. The third prince sat in his own tent and frowned as he pondered. After a while, he realized that something was not right. How did Lei Qiusheng end up like this? It was because the Qingjiang Empire and Shuangjin Empire had joined forces with the Hengduan Mountains and the Dragon Palace of the Four Seas to attack the Shenwu dynasty at the same time. As a result, even the basic garrison troops were transferred to the front line. Although the front line looked stable, the interior was as soft as mud. Not to mention the northern frontier king and the Qingpeng king, even the rebels could threaten Lei Qiusheng's position. However, why would the four forces join forces to attack the Shenwu dynasty? With the third prince's wisdom that did not match that of the people in the grassland, he quickly thought of the top forces that were above the empire. It was obvious that Lei Qiusheng had offended one of the top forces because of something. That was why there was a war everywhere, giving the aristocratic families and sects who coveted the high position space to cause trouble. After joining forces with Lei Qiusheng, the situation gradually became clear. The thing that made the top forces hate the Shenwu dynasty so much that they used all their influence to make the four forces join forces should still be in Lei Qiusheng's hands. Otherwise, both the Shuangjin Empire and the Qingjiang Empire would have withdrawn their troops and returned to the empire. After all, the monster horde in the Hengduan Mountains would not reason with them. Since they had no military strength, the neighboring empires would not miss this opportunity to loot a burning house. However, the strange thing was that the forces that bordered the Qingjiang Empire and the Shuangjin Empire did not attack them at all. It was only after they attacked the northern frontier that the monster horde broke out on the Shuangjin grassland again. All the signs pointed to the fact that the item was still in Lei Qiusheng's hands. Also, the reason why he dared to take the risk was that the item could help him turn the tables after his plan of driving the wolves to devour the tigers. He could destroy the Frost Mirror cavalry that invaded the Shenwu dynasty. Thinking of this, the third prince's forehead was instantly covered in a fine layer of cold sweat. Shakily standing up from his soft couch, the third prince walked step by step towards the door of the tent. This was not because his body was weak. On the contrary, the fact that he was able to maintain his fair and smooth skin on the Frost Mirror grassland was not because he was talented. Rather, it was because the third prince had cultivated at a terrifying speed since he was a child. He was only in his 30s, but he had already reached the Heaven Star realm. With his stellar energy protecting his body, he was naturally impervious to the cold wind. In terms of cultivation alone, the third prince was probably the strongest of the Frost Mirror Khagan's many sons. Unfortunately, leading an army into battle did not depend on the cultivation of the general. There were many other factors that had to be considered. Although the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of strategy and adaptability, the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of motivation, morale, and courage. Therefore, the 13th prince was Badalu, and the third prince was just the third prince. Your Highness, why are you? The two Bloodspan knights in charge of guarding the tent paled when they saw the third prince walk out of the tent. On the Frost Mirror grassland, where the 13th prince's fate was unknown, the third prince could not become the first successor of the Bloodspan tribe. However, the cunning third prince controlled the Blood Eagles. With the cunning of a fox and the eyes of an eagle, the third prince was practically the brain of the entire Bloodspan tribe. He spent most of his time in his tent, processing the intelligence reports from the Blood Eagles and formulating a plan of action for the Bloodspan tribe. Unless something major was about to happen, the third prince rarely left his tent. After all, the intelligence reports were already outdated. If he did not check them in time and did not react in time, the entire tribe might be plunged into an unknown and desperate situation that concerned the survival of the tribe. The third prince looked at the guards with a pale face and said in a low voice, "This matter is of great importance. It is not convenient for me to meet with my father directly. I can only trouble you to go first and tell my father that no matter what he is doing, he is to postpone everything and wait for me. Just say that our Reflection Frost dynasty is in grave danger. If we don't handle this matter properly, not only the Bloodbath tribe, but all the other tribes on the Reflection Frost plains will be wiped out." What a guy. When the guards heard this, their faces instantly paled. The third prince never spoke without thinking. Now that he said this, it meant that a great disaster was about to happen on the Frost Mirror grassland. The guards did not know that the exhausted Shinwu dynasty would not be able to stop the Shuangjian dynasty from taking the imperial capital now that the army had moved out in full force. However, the third prince was never one to speak empty words. Many people even respected the third prince with titles such as prophet or sage. This was because the things that the third prince had predicted over the past 10 years were all reflected in the time and place that he had predicted. Yes, I will go and see the great Khan now. After all, the third prince's guards were the brains of the Bloodspan tribe. Although they only had the title of a guard, their status was not inferior to the generals other than the princes. As long as they reported to the great Khan, they would be able to see him. Also, the third prince turned to look in the direction of the Shinwu dynasty and said with a dark face, "We have to be prepared for both sides. My father has always favored the 13th prince, but it seems that he has died on the northern frontier. I am worried that my father will send troops out in anger and destroy all the tribes on the Frost Mirror grassland. Find a group of trustworthy people and inform the chiefs of the other tribes to come here for a meeting. Even if we have to force him, we cannot let my father continue this war." The guard trembled and his face paled, but his eyes flashed with determination. He said in a low voice, "Yes." Everyone knew that Shuangjian Khan favored the 13th prince. However, they were both Shuangjian Khan's sons. How could the third prince, who was the most talented and the wisest, not be interested in Shuangjian Khan's throne? If he succeeded in forcing the third prince to abdicate this time, he would have succeeded the third prince. As long as he could win this war, he would be a big shot in the Bloodspan tribe and even in the Shuangjian dynasty. When the time came, the third prince might even allow him to leave with his tribesmen and establish his own tribe. For a better life in the future, for a lord who could rule over a region. It was a gamble. The third prince, who did not know the guard's complicated thoughts, sighed as he watched the guard leave. He looked in the direction of the Shinwu dynasty and murmured, "I hope it is not too late." Chapter 501. If the Shuangjian dynasty could get their hands on information, the northern frontier would naturally be able to get their hands on it. In fact, they would be able to get their hands on it much faster. Looking at the report on the table that had been confirmed by the Association of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guard, Li Zhong's eyes were filled with doubt. Was Lei Qiusheng crazy, or was he making a huge gamble? Or was he trying to drag the northern frontier down with him? Li Zhong believed that a person at Lei Qiusheng's level wouldn't lose their will to fight just because of a momentary loss. He also didn't believe that Lei Qiusheng would make such a crazy decision. If that was the case, then he would have to wonder if the person who had invaded the country with a strong army was the current divine martial emperor Lei Qiusheng. Once the northern frontier army retreats back to the central plains, the Frost Mirror cavalry will be able to attack the Shinwu dynasty unscrupulously. Of course, they might also attack our northern frontier. Judging from the factors of this simultaneous invasion, the Shuangjian dynasty's tribes, big and small, should be more inclined to plunder the Shinwu dynasty, which is currently lacking in battle strength. However, the disappearance of the 13th prince will cause the Frost Mirror Khan to target the northern frontier. Lei Qiusheng's seemingly crazy move has hit the nail on the head. If we go to stop the Shuangjian dynasty, we will have to split off our already small forces to take over the defense line left behind by the Shinwu dynasty's frontier army. Not only will it be a waste of effort, but it will also be easy for Lei Qiusheng to attack us. However, if we don't stop the Shuangjian dynasty, we will have to face the most elite Shuai Liao cavalry. Without the Shuai Liao knights who could contend against the divine martial Chongbu, with the strength of the Shenwu dynasty's border army and Lei Qiusheng's plans, it would be more than enough to defeat the Shuangjin dynasty's invasion. When the time came, Lei Qiusheng would be able to reverse his decline and rebuild the morale of the army. Then, he would be able to find an opportunity to fight us head-on. Right now, the northern frontier's strength is barely enough to deal with Lei Qiusheng, who has recovered 50% of his strength. Add to that the Blood Liao Knight's attack, and we can't mobilize more than 30% of our troops. Unless Uncle Gao's defensive fortifications along the river are miraculous, Lei Qiusheng will be able to catch his breath and kill us with a single punch. Li Zhong muttered to himself. His eyes gradually regained their clarity. He said coldly, "What a Lei Qiusheng." Everyone's wisdom was different, and the level at which they looked at problems was also different. Eunuch Zhuo was on the first level, and he could only see the harm of Lei Qiusheng's move. The third prince was on the second level, and he could see the harm of Lei Qiusheng's move. He could also see the benefits from it and derive a series of calculations. Li Zhong was on the third level, and he directly eliminated the areas that were harmful to the Shenwu dynasty. He found the most crucial point and even used it to deduce the unfavorable situation the northern frontier would soon face. As for which level Lei Qiusheng was on, perhaps only he himself knew. When an expert made a move, the truth would be revealed. Lei Qiusheng had chosen between the north and the south to survive. On one hand, he catered to the north to force the south, but on the other hand, he was worried that the north would become too powerful and difficult to control in the future. Under this kind of worrying situation, no matter how good a card he played, it would be a lousy one. It would be very easy for Li Zhong, Lin Yuan, and other people with great wisdom to find the flaws, and then break his killing moves one by one and counterattack. Even at this point, not only had Lei Qiusheng not solved the trouble in the south, he had not even mobilized Lei Qiusheng and the rebel army in the south. If not for Lin Yuan's tit-for-tat by letting the cultists land in the south, perhaps the south would still be stable and waiting for Lei Qiusheng to be forced into a corner by the northern frontier. At that time, no matter what conditions the aristocratic families in the south offered, Lei Qiusheng would have to pinch his nose and accept them, and the scales of victory would begin to tilt towards the interest groups in the south. At that point, whether it was Lei Qiusheng or Lin Yuan, they would both become losers. It was just a matter of who would lose more in the end. But at the moment when he was completely on the verge of defeat, Lei Qiusheng was able to sweep away all his worries and boldly adopt the method of no construction without destruction to meet the attack of the northern frontier. Moreover, he changed his previous scheming attitude and chose to use an open and above-board scheme. He made the Shuangjin dynasty his butcher's knife. While suppressing the northern frontier and sweeping away the aristocratic families in the central plains, he concentrated his forces to defend the imperial city and the nearby territories. With the Shuangjin barbarians' fighting style of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, he was bound to bypass the imperial city, which was a fat piece of meat, and directly sweep through the territory of the interest groups in the south. The cultists, the Frost Mirror Barbarian, and the interest groups in the south would first fight each other, and then Lei Qiusheng would suddenly close the door and beat the dogs, directly eliminating all the internal problems. Even the aristocratic families that gave him a headache were swept away by the Shuangjin barbarian. How many of them would be left unharmed? How many of them would dare to challenge Lei Qiusheng? How could he count on the aristocratic families near the imperial city that Lei Qiusheng was toying with? Moreover, the Shuangjin barbarian would not continue to attack the Shenwu dynasty. Instead, they would retreat to the Frost Mirror grasslands to lick their wounds. At that time, if the northern frontier still could not deal with the problem of the Blood Liao Knights, it would be a huge joke. Should he take this move or not? For the first time, Li Zhong felt that the wisdom he was so proud of was actually useless at this moment. He realized that compared to ambitious and ruthless characters like Lei Qiusheng and Lin Yuan, he lacked the most crucial thing, courage. He did not want to waste his energy fighting the Shuangjin dynasty, but he also did not want to take the risk of Lei Qiusheng rebuilding his confidence. At this moment, he did not know what to do. Your Highness, battle report. A guard strode into Li Zhong's office and placed a battle report on Li Zhong's desk. Li Zhong tore open the wax seal on the envelope and took out the letter. His face immediately turned ashen as if he had eaten a fly. While he was still making preparations, Lei Chuxing had already begun to move. At present, most of the northern border army had been wiped out, and the rest were fighting as they retreated toward the central plains. After all, these border armies had been stationed at the border for many years and had encountered the barbarians of the Shuangjin dynasty more than once or twice in the wilderness. While they might not be evenly matched, they would not be routed so quickly. This is troublesome. This is really troublesome. Li Zhong felt his temples throbbing with pain. Lei Chuxing had actually played a dirty trick right in front of them. According to Li Zhong's usual logic, Lei Chuxing's orders would be delivered to the border by trusted officials, and then the border army commanders would have to verify the authenticity of the orders before destroying the fortifications and slowly retreating to the vicinity of the imperial capital. But just as he received news that Lei Chuxing was cutting off all means of retreat, the border army had already moved. What did this mean? It meant that Lei Chuxing had given the Northern Frontier Intelligence Agency a vicious slap to the face. Chapter 502. Lei Chuxing's order had already bypassed the intelligence system of the Northern Frontier and reached the border army. He pretended to be in the servants' administration just to confuse the intelligence agency of the Northern Frontier. He wanted Li Zhong and the others to think about it for a while when they received the message. Then he would take advantage of the time to mobilize the border army. In this way, no matter how fast the Northern Frontier's response was, it would be a joke. Because the border army had started to retreat in an orderly manner. Could the Northern Frontier attack the border army under the pressure of the Shuangjin barbarian and cut off their retreat? If the Northern Frontier really had that kind of strength, how could they be forced to this step? At the same time, it was also a challenge. How many troops do we have left? Li Zhong looked up at the guard who didn't have time to retreat, looking very gloomy. The guard thought for a while and said bitterly, "The main force of the southern expedition is in the border army to carry out the plan of the Great Wall. Some of them are in the north to clean up the rebels or to entangle the Frost Mirror barbarian who got separated from the main force. The Falling Star army is now surveying the terrain near Wei River City, preparing to build a position to resist the naval attack of the Shenwu dynasty. The subhuman army is fighting with the demon beasts, so some of them are scattered in the forests. It's hard to gather them in a short time. If your highness wants to mobilize the troops as soon as possible, only the northern army hasn't been mobilized yet." Li Zhong was now a criminal. Without Lin Yuan's permission, the 100,000 guards of the prince's mansion were not allowed to leave Shunning City. They had already made a mistake once. If they made another mistake, no matter how good Li Zhong's reputation was, no one would be able to keep his head. Luckily, the northern army in the northern frontier could be mobilized, though the guards couldn't be mobilized. Li Zhong thought for a while and scolded with a smile, "Mobilize the northern army? Then it's better not to do anything." The northern battlefront army, which had just been expanded twice, was disbanded recently. Those experienced soldiers were all sent to the front line. Even the soldiers we lost in the rebellion of the 3 cities were sent from the northern battlefront army. Do you think they still have people? Well, the guard touched his head and smiled. Even so, they are one of the 3 armies in the northern frontier. They can spare 100,000 soldiers, can't they? Your Highness, you think too much. He could tell that this prince didn't care about his own life at all. He knew that this was a job that would cost him his head, but he still wanted to take the 100,000 guards out and wrestle with the border troops of the Shenwu dynasty who had retreated back to the central plains. Li Zhong shook his head helplessly and smiled bitterly. The northern army can't even gather 600,000 soldiers, and they have to be stationed in different places in the northern frontier. It's a chaotic time. Who knows how many demons and monsters are going to cause trouble? Almost all the bright gown guards are going to fight with the army. The local troops and the Association of Demon Kings can't suppress the northern frontier. Besides, Li Zhong stopped abruptly. He waved his hand and said, "Anyway, the northern army can't be mobilized. Within 4 hours, you have to bring me at least 100,000 soldiers. Otherwise, the guards of the royal palace will go out to fight. Even if we can't kill all the border army of the Shenwu dynasty, we have to try our best to wipe them out. As soon as he finished speaking, Li Zhong's face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Some words couldn't be heard by a mere guard. The northern frontier wasn't a paradise where everyone was united. There was a lot of blood hidden under the peaceful land. Various factions wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fight for enough benefits for themselves. Although they had all given up on the position of the actual ruler under Lin Yuan, this did not mean that they were pure of heart and did not care about anything. It was like the aristocratic families that depended on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce to survive. How could the Qiao family and the Shui family be compared with the other aristocratic families? Although the forces that depended on the northern frontier were controlled by the factions and wouldn't think about being the leader, they would take this opportunity to suppress and scheme against each other because of their irreconcilable hatred. Even if they were punished afterwards, they would still do it. These actions were the same as the forces that rebelled in the Shenwu dynasty. It was just that they didn't have the resources and strength to stand on their own in the northern frontier. They could only drag down the forces of the other factions and try their best to eliminate more forces to increase their own speaking rights. Usually, the northern frontier looked peaceful on the surface. However, at this critical moment, no one could be sure whether they were loyal or not. Li Zhong didn't know who he could trust. He could only let them work together according to their original factions and try his best to avoid infighting. However, there were some ticking time bombs that he had to guard against. For example, Zhang Qilin. The guard had a bitter expression on his face. He could only helplessly accept this task before turning around and leaving the office. He didn't have as many misgivings as Li Zhong. Naturally, he didn't have as many worries as Li Zhong. However, Li Zhong was now their master. Once Li Zhong fell from power, they could forget about having good days in the future. I really envy you guys. You don't have to think so much. Li Zhong looked at the guard who was gradually walking away and shook his head with a bitter smile. However, a moment later, Li Zhong's face returned to its cold and indifferent expression. However, a trace of madness appeared in his eyes. Didn't you, Lei Qiusheng, want to play an open scheme with us and turn the area around the imperial capital into a place where anyone who touches you will have to stab their hands with blood? This old man doesn't believe in this evil. While you're organizing a defensive position, this old man will do his best to eliminate the effective forces in your hands and let those Shuangjin barbarian people bleed first. Let's see if you can still sit still on the fishing platform. Li Zhong's strategy wasn't weak. However, he didn't have Lei Qiusheng's boldness. However, this didn't matter. Even a rabbit would bite when cornered. If he couldn't find a way to deal with Lei Qiusheng's open scheme with his own courage, then he might as well give up on his reasoning and use an absolutely bold and crazy strategy. In any case, Lei Qiusheng dared to act as if he was going to drag the northern frontier down with him. How could the northern frontier not dare to accept this? However, on the surface, Lei Qiusheng wanted to drag the northern frontier down with him. However, he still had a trump card in his hands. It didn't matter even if he didn't achieve the desired effect. In any case, Lei Qiusheng was extremely confident that he would still be the ruler of the Shenwu dynasty. He wouldn't become a speck of dust in the long river of history because of a small disturbance. However, Li Zhong's crazy response was just a risky move. To put it bluntly, it was just a bluff. In his heart, he really did have some thoughts of dragging Lei Qiusheng down with him. Chapter 503. But it doesn't matter. After all, I still have the Dragon King behind me. The madness in Li Zhong's eyes gradually subsided. Lei Qiusheng had some unknown trump cards in his hands, but how could Li Zhong not have any trump cards in his hands? The situation had already become so dangerous, but Lin Yuan didn't show any signs of panic. He didn't even have the intention to recall the army in the south back to the northern frontier to fight together. That must be because Lin Yuan still had other cards that he hadn't played yet. Li Zhong knew his position, so he also knew that no matter how much power Lin Yuan gave him, he was still a puppet. And no matter how much a puppet struggled, it was still within the scope of Lin Yuan's ability. As long as Li Zhong wasn't stupid enough to cancel Lin Yuan's original arrangements and order all the troops in the northern frontier to die, then Lin Yuan would still be able to clean up the situation. There was indeed only one ruler in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong, as the king of the northern frontier, still had a lot of power in his hands. In addition, Lin Yuan deliberately molded Li Zhong into a positive figure who always thought for the common people. Anything that was beneficial to the people in the northern frontier would be credited to Li Zhong. The dirty work was basically done by people like Luo Su, Shi Dong, and Xia Xiu. This was because Lin Yuan was very clear that the law of the jungle could be absolutely observed in the Hengduan Mountains. But outside the Hengduan Mountains, when dealing with these people, he had to consider everyone's feelings from all aspects. For example, those capable officials who had real talent, hated war, and could really bring benefits to a region would definitely not be willing to serve under a warmonger like Lin Yuan. After all, Lin Yuan's actions were completely different from the ideals they had molded since childhood. Naturally, they wouldn't favor him, but the development of the northern frontier couldn't be done without them. Therefore, Li Zhong appeared. With Li Zhong as the leader, it was a completely different matter. Not just the people on the northern frontier, even the arrogant sages of the Confucian sect mentioned the reforms on the northern frontier. Even though they knew that they were growing on the corpses of the noble families and sects, they did bring benefits to the people. They even removed the opportunity for the noble families and sects as middlemen to suck the wealth of the people. The people received benefits, and so did the income of the rulers. Therefore, no one could go against their conscience and say that the reform of the northern frontier was a strategy to bring chaos to the country. Even though they all knew that the reforms and laws at the northern frontier were all made by Lin Yuan, the exotic beast, they still couldn't believe it. However, since Lin Yuan wanted to give the credit to Li Zhong, these humans agreed to it. They were willing to be blind and not come out to refute. Naturally, there would be talented people who didn't see the twists and turns in the process who came to the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhong's position in the northern frontier was very special. Different from the previous two kings of the northern frontier, although Li Zhong didn't have his own faction, his orders carried much more weight than the previous two kings. This was because he was a sign for Lin Yuan to recruit talents. Even if Li Zhong wanted to die, Lin Yuan had to find a way to protect him. I hope you won't walk on that path of death. Li Zhong placed his hands behind his back and sighed faintly. The situation at the northern frontier was indeed complicated. However, Zhang Qilin and Shenlin Jun, who used to be reserve soldiers, were even more difficult to deal with. These people were 100% loyal to Lei Qiusheng. When Luo Su was teaching Li Zhongsheng, Lin Yuan promoted Zhang Qilin and let him lead those people to build the northern army. Therefore, Li Zhongsheng was under the subtle influence. His loyalty to Lei Qiusheng was no longer what it used to be. This time, Lei Qiusheng's action of no building without destruction had greatly impacted Li Zhongsheng, who had been nurtured in the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhongsheng, who was far away in the front line, might not be absolutely loyal to Lin Yuan. However, when it came to protecting the people of the northern frontier, Li Zhongsheng would spare no effort to complete it. Therefore, the Great Wall plan would never have any mistakes. However, Zhang Qilin, who had been hanging out with those old brothers, wasn't affected by this. These people still maintained absolute loyalty to Lei Qiusheng. Since Lei Qiusheng could bypass the intelligence agencies of the northern frontier and move the border army to retreat under their noses, then it was impossible for him not to bypass their spies and send the secret edict to Zhang Qilin. At this critical moment, it was better to be stabbed by someone from the inside than to fight against those barbarians of the Shuangjin dynasty. Li Zhongsheng stayed in the northern frontier as a prisoner because he wanted to keep an eye on Zhang Qilin and those old subordinates of Li Zhongsheng. However, now that Lei Qiusheng had taken such drastic measures, only an idiot would let those border army soldiers leave. However, if he moved, no one could guarantee that Zhang Qilin wouldn't act rashly. Before this, the northern frontier's troops were all sent from the northern battlefront army. Of course, it wasn't because the soldiers of the northern battlefront army were strong and had good training. It was because Lin Yuan didn't want Zhang Qilin and those reserve soldiers of Shenlin Jun to make the northern battlefront army into a private army. That was why he wanted to use this method to scatter those officers of Shen Lin Jun's reserve soldiers into different troops so that they couldn't cooperate with each other. 2 flowers bloomed, one on each side. Let's not talk about the scheming in the northern frontier for now. Li Zhongsheng, who was near Donglin City, wasn't having a good time at the moment. Because of the Shenwu dynasty's border army's retreat, the original barrier naturally didn't exist anymore. Although the Shenwu dynasty's army wouldn't go deep into the northern frontier's territory, they wouldn't come near the border and cause trouble near Donglin City, which was heavily guarded. However, even if the Shenwu dynasty's army didn't come, it didn't mean that the Shuangjin dynasty's barbarians were so sensible. As soon as the border army retreated from the fortifications, the barbarians rushed in impatiently. After all, the border army had been ordered to defend the defensive line for the past few days. Not to mention supplies, even the scouts couldn't penetrate the defensive line. Therefore, the 1.2 million Frost Mirror barbarian from before had completely lost contact with them. Now that things had developed to this point, it wasn't just a matter of the missing 13th prince anymore. If the 150,000 Blood Gold Knights were wiped out here, even Frost Mirror Khan wouldn't be able to stop the decline of the Blood Gold tribe, let alone the 13th prince. If the 1.05 million cavalrymen were also lost, who knew how many tribes would be wiped out this winter? Because of this, the chiefs of the Shenwu dynasty's territory were extremely anxious. They repeatedly ordered the northern frontier to release these warriors even if they had to suffer some losses. Therefore, more and more Frost Mirror barbarian rushed into the Shenwu dynasty's territory like wolves and tigers, urgently wanting to get in touch with the vanguard troops. Chapter 504. Previously, Li Zhongxing had used a different strategy to eliminate the vanguard troops, so he could treat them as if they did not exist. But now that the Great Wall plan was halfway through, if he allowed this large wave of barbarians to pass through, the entire plan would become a joke. Moreover, even if these barbarians were not very smart, it was impossible for them to allow the northern territory to build a defensive fortification that could isolate them from their territory. Damn it, let's go all out. Li Zhongxing unsheathed the long sword at his waist and said fiercely, "Don't panic. Craftsman, finish your work in an orderly manner. My men will escort you back to the safety of Donglin City in an orderly manner. Leave 5,000 men to guard the craftsman. The rest of you, follow me and prepare to fight those barbarians." Almost all of the soldiers following Li Zhongxing were the elites of the southern expedition. Apart from the first batch he had brought out, the rest were all veterans who had participated in the encirclement and suppression of the rebel army in the north. Although the quality of their battle was not up to par, they had still been honed on the battlefield. These soldiers naturally exuded the aura of an invincible army. The Shuangjin barbarian army arrived in an instant, but they did not break through the enemy's formation and charge immediately. Instead, they set up camp 15 li away from Donglin City, seemingly intending to engage in a tug-of-war with Li Zhongxing's headquarters. This was the first time the two sides had met. Even the arrogant Shuangjin barbarian army did not dare to be careless at this moment. After all, the 13th prince, 200,000 Bloodridge cavalrymen, and 450,000 cavalrymen from various tribes had all been lost in the north. Now that the brothers who had invaded the Central Plains had regained contact with them, those who had entered the northern territory were like clay oxen entering the sea. It was as if they had disappeared directly. Given the barbarians' character of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, even if they had not personally experienced the battle with the northern frontier army, they would still realize that the so-called information about the northern frontier being weak was all fabricated by the Shenwu dynasty to deceive them. The one who was truly weak was the Shenwu dynasty. However, now that things had developed to this point, the Mirror Frost dynasty did not have the spare energy to cause trouble for the Shenwu dynasty for the time being. After all, their brothers, as well as the 13th prince, whom the Khan had placed all his hopes on, were all trapped in the north. If this matter was not handled properly, the Mirror Frost Khan would be enraged, and countless heads would roll. Both sides had merely set up a battle formation and were facing each other. Unexpectedly, neither side had any intention of taking the initiative to attack. The first day slowly passed by in this kind of stalemate between wanting to say something but hesitating to do so. It was not until noon of the second day that a rider came out of the Shuangjin dynasty's military tent, claiming to be the messenger of the Khan of Frost. Li Zhongxing's camp was built behind the cement wall. Because the fortification had just begun construction, even with the help of cement, it was impossible to complete it in a short period of time. Moreover, this fortification was only outside Donglin City and had not yet been connected to the planned cities. Naturally, the Shuangjin barbarian did not know that this was the wall of despair that they would encounter in the future. It was just a temporary fortification built by the Northern Frontier Army. The ranger in charge of guarding the place held the so-called messenger on the ground and carefully searched him. After making sure that he did not carry any weapons, he was escorted into the main camp to meet with Li Zhongxing. After entering the commander's tent, the messenger did not mock Li Zhongxing with a sneer on his face. Instead, he cupped his fist with a solemn face and said in a deep voice, "I am Teng, the young chief of the Green Carp tribe in the Frost Mirror grassland. Greetings to all the generals." The moment his voice fell, all the generals in the commander's tent looked at each other in dismay. Then, their eyes fell on Li Zhongxing's face at the same time. It was said that the Shuangjin barbarian was rude and unreasonable. But now, this messenger had changed his usual behavior. There must be something fishy going on. "I am Li Zhongxing, the commander of the southern expedition in the northern frontier." Li Zhongxing sat on the tiger-skin chair, looked down at Teng and said in a deep voice, "The Shuangjin dynasty started the war without declaring war. First, they attacked our northern frontier territory. Now that the army is here again, the young chief has changed his usual behavior. This is really confusing." Hearing this, Teng blushed. He cleared his throat and said, "There is something you don't know, Marshal Li. Our Shuangjin dynasty was deceived by a scoundrel. We didn't know that the northern frontier and the Shenwu dynasty had broken off relations. That's why we attacked the northern frontier territory. I'm sure you also know that our Shuangjin dynasty and the Shenwu dynasty have been at war for more than half a year. When we suddenly saw a hole in our border, we naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity." Teng's words weren't nonsense. After all, the northern frontier belonged to the Shenwu dynasty. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian clearly came for the northern frontier, they didn't penetrate the northern frontier, let alone enter the territory of the northern frontier. In addition, the Frost Mirror barbarian had come for the Central Plains. So, if they braced themselves and said that they came to attack the Shenwu dynasty, no one could say anything about it. Oh. Li Zhongxing suddenly understood and raised his head. He smiled and said, "Young chief means that you attacked the wrong people?" Yes, that's what I meant." Teng's face was still red, but it wasn't clear whether it was due to excitement or embarrassment. Li Zhongxing's face suddenly darkened. He said in a strange tone, "Young chief is so sure of this statement. Do you think that I and everyone else are fools? If our northern frontier army entered the Shuangjin dynasty and killed, and then we told you that we were actually going for the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range, would you believe us?" As soon as he finished speaking, the generals in the tent suddenly burst into laughter. Teng's face became even redder. After all, they had all watched the Shuangjin barbarian invade the north. They didn't even look at them, who were disguised as the Shenwu dynasty's troops, and directly rushed to the northern frontier. If the Shuangjin dynasty really came for the Shenwu dynasty, how could they let go of the cities and troops in the north? Donglin City was intact, and they were unharmed. This was a ruthless slap to the Shuangjin dynasty's face. This is not the same. Teng's face alternated between green and red. He whispered, "Your northern frontier army can directly enter the Hengduan mountain range. Why do you need to use our Frost Mirror grassland?" Li Zhongxing smiled and shook his head. He mocked, "Then why can't your Frost Mirror cavalry gather their forces and directly attack the Central Plains and take over the imperial capital? Why do you have to divide your forces to attack our northern frontier territory? You can divide your forces, but can't we?" Teng's chest rose and fell violently. He stared fiercely at Li Zhongxing, but he couldn't spit out a single word. In terms of sharp tongues, even 100 of him wouldn't be a match for these people. But now, he had to lower his head. Chapter 505. You're being bullied to this extent and you're still not angry? As Li Zhongxing mocked Kai Yan, his eyes flashed with a sharp light as he began to secretly plan. The Shuangjin dynasty hasn't changed much, but they also have experts on their side. They know that Lei Qiusheng wants to use them to clean up the families and sects of the Shenwu dynasty and suppress us at the same time. When the matter is almost done, Lei Qiusheng will make his move. At that time, those Shuangjin barbarian in the south of the Shenwu dynasty won't be able to come out. Therefore, they can only set their sights on the northern frontier, hoping to liberate their forces from our side and ensure that the Shuangjin dynasty won't be greatly damaged by Lei Qiusheng's scheme. After all, after this matter is over, many forces will want a share of the profits. Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice interrupted Li Zhongxing's contemplation. Li Zhongxing looked around and didn't see any signs of Lin Yuan's existence. He then heard Lin Yuan say, "I'm talking directly to you through my consciousness, so only you can hear my voice. You don't need to find out where I am. Just deal with the matter at hand and try to stall for time. Wait for our people to kill the Frost Mirror barbarian in the northern frontier, but don't deliberately cause a conflict." With Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing's thoughts inexplicably calmed down. Clearing his throat, Li Zhongxing said with a smile, "Young clan leader, you don't need to take it to heart. I'm just complaining. If it were you, young clan leader, you wouldn't easily swallow this resentment after being beaten up for no reason, right?" "Yes, I don't know what request Commander Li has. Please tell us. The Shuangjin dynasty will do our best to satisfy you." Seeing that Li Zhongxing was giving him a way out, even though Kai Teng had been humiliated to the point of wanting to die, he had no choice but to pinch his nose and agree. However, this time, Kai Teng emphasized the words reflection of the Frost dynasty. He wanted to remind Li Zhongxing that he was not alone. There were still millions of reflection of the Frost cavalry outside. If the two sides could not come to an agreement, they would have to fight. If the two of them had a normal conversation, Li Zhongxing might have to think twice before bargaining. However, with Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing no longer had any desire to negotiate. This was because Lin Yuan never intended to give him any face from the beginning. In the end, they would still have to fight. After pondering for a moment, Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He smiled and said, "Young clan leader, you're too polite. I'm just a commander. Even if I want to negotiate, I'm not qualified. How about this? Young clan leader, go back and rest for 2 days. I'll quickly send a letter to the Northern Frontier Mansion and let the king of the Northern Frontier count the casualties before coming back to talk to young clan leader." Although Kai Yan was smiling, he was cursing in his heart. Of course, he knew that Li Zhongxing's rank wasn't high enough to negotiate with them. However, as one of the 3 commanders of the Northern Frontier, Li Zhongxing's words still carried a certain amount of weight on the northern frontier. More importantly, Li Zhongxing and his men were currently at the pass. As long as he didn't agree, his brothers trapped in the north wouldn't be able to come out. They wouldn't even be able to send in supplies. Who knew how many people would die in these 2 days? Licking his lips, Kai Yan asked tentatively, "Commander Li, I came here with sincerity. However, I don't see any sincerity from your side. How about you open a path and let the warriors of the Shuangjin dynasty who mistakenly entered the northern frontier return home?" Humph. Almost instantly, Li Zhongxing heard 2 cold snorts. One voice came from Lin Yuan, and the other voice came from a middle-aged scholar in a gray robe in the tent. The middle-aged scholar cupped his fists toward Li Zhongxing, then looked at Kai Yan with a gloomy face and said in a cold voice, "Warriors? Those barbarians may seem like warriors to you, but in the eyes of the northern frontier, they are complete sinners. This young master, your Shuangjin dynasty wantonly invaded our northern frontier, committing all kinds of crimes. Now that you see that the situation isn't right, you send someone over to say a few words and want us to let them go? Isn't the price of invading our northern frontier a little too low? You are The corners of Kei Yan's mouth twitched as he gloomily stared at the middle-aged scholar. After all, Li Zhongxing's army was blocking the path that they had to pass through. No matter what, he was a mountain that could not be bypassed. The Shuangjin dynasty did not want to waste their military power in such a meaningless place, so they naturally had to say all they could. However, if it was someone else who came to talk to him, he would not be so good-tempered. If it were not for the fact that this middle-aged scholar was Li Zhongxing's subordinate, he would have already brandished his blade and cut him down. Qin family of Taizong, Qin Zifang. The middle-aged scholar coldly stared back at Kei Yan without the slightest hint of panic in his eyes. Qin Zifang was a traitor on the side of the aristocratic families during the rebellion of the Three Cities. He might not be first-rate in terms of cultivation or strategy, but his insight was unparalleled. From the moment the northern frontier prince's residents began to carry out military orders, he understood one thing: Lin Yuan had no intention of letting go of the Shuangjin dynasty's cavalry that had entered the northern frontier. In other words, Lin Yuan's original intention was to completely fall out with the Shuangjin dynasty. With such a style, either Lin Yuan was not worried about the Shuangjin dynasty's revenge, or he had something that could threaten the Shuangjin dynasty. Coupled with Li Zhongxing's current attitude, how could Qin Zifang, who had already seen through everything, not jump out and make his presence known in the eyes of the Dragon King? Never heard of you. But then again, you don't have the right to talk to me. Kei Yan disdainfully shook his head and sneered, do you think that the Shuangjin dynasty is weak and easy to bully just because I say a few words? Do you really want us to break into this weak camp of yours and hold our swords to your necks before you're willing to talk? The Shuangjin dynasty's soldiers were used to being rude. After Kei Yan finished speaking, he felt that he had finally vented the anger in his heart. Especially after he finished speaking, the generals in the tent no longer dared to say anything else, especially the more timid ones. At this moment, a thin layer of cold sweat had even seeped out of their foreheads. Seeing this scene, Kei Yan felt even more confident. After all, not wanting to lose manpower was one thing. The main reason the Shuangjin dynasty's army was willing to stop and negotiate with Li Zhongxing was because this army was at its peak and had an oppressive aura. Once the two sides started fighting, the Shuangjin dynasty's army might not be able to gain much of an advantage. But now, he realized that although the soldiers below were full of fighting spirit, the generals who made the decision might not have the courage to fight to the death with the Shuangjin dynasty. Clang! Before Kei Yan could feel smug for long, Li Zhongxing stood up from his tiger-skin chair and drew his personal guard saber. He walked over to Kei Yan with a majestic gait, his eyes blooming with killing intent. Since young clan leader has said so, then let's talk after we fight. Chapter 506. As soon as Li Zhongxing's challenge ended, the generals and strategists in the tent no longer hesitated. They all stared at Kei Teng like hungry wolves as if he was a piece of juicy pork. Just being stared at by the generals made Kei Teng break out in a cold sweat. He originally thought that these generals of the southern expedition were unwilling to go to war with the dual sword dynasty. However, after Li Zhongxing spoke, their sudden change in attitude revealed the problem. They weren't afraid of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty. Instead, they were worried that the crime of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the northern frontier would fall on their heads. By then, no matter who won or lost, there would be rivers of blood on both sides. Whoever started the war would be the sinner. Now that Li Zhongxing had taken on the responsibility, they naturally didn't have any scruples. After all, they were all soldiers. Kei Ting could also understand the attitude of the generals of the southern expedition. If they didn't go to war, how long would they have to endure before they had the chance to be promoted? Marshal Li, you'd better think this through. The Reflection Frost dynasty has come with sincerity. As long as you release our people, we can negotiate any compensation you want. But if you insist on not giving way, we'll carve out a path of blood to bring our brothers home even if we have to kill you. Kei Ting swallowed his saliva as he sensed the shocking killing intent from Li Zhongxing. His face turned slightly pale. Putting aside the fact that his cultivation wasn't as good as Li Zhongxing's, even if he could defeat Li Zhongxing in a one-on-one fight, there were still the generals of the northern frontier and close to 1,000,000 soldiers of the southern expedition. What was the difference between wanting to kill his way out of this military camp in his unarmed state? Li Zhongxing stopped and rubbed the tip of his nose. He sneered and said, it seems like young clan leader is afraid. Nonsense. Kei Ting's face turned red again. He suppressed his voice and said, the men of the Shuangjin dynasty aren't afraid of anything. It's just a misunderstanding between us and the northern frontier. Now that we're willing to apologize, why must Marshal Li be so overbearing? Do you think Marshal Li will still have a good reputation if we fight? Clang. Li Zhongxing flicked the blade in his hand, pointing it straight at Kei Chen as he fiercely said, young patriarch, are you mistaken? Right now, it's the Shuangjin dynasty that's invading the northern frontier. I'm just protecting the country. I didn't send people to invade the Frost Mirror grassland to create friction. The Shuangjin dynasty was the one who started the war. Now, you're the ones asking for peace. Young clan leader can't be so naive as to think that we, the people of the northern frontier, have no temper, right? As soon as he finished speaking, the entire tent was filled with chaotic shouts of killing. The northern frontier was slightly better, especially the cities near the Central Plains. At the very least, they could be nourished by the Central Plains caravans. However, the living environment of the northern frontier wasn't much better than the Frost Mirror grassland. The only thing that could attract the caravans to bring all kinds of necessities to the northern frontier was a large amount of spiritual items and demon flesh. These were precious materials that were worth tens of thousands of gold taels in rich places. Therefore, if the people of the northern frontier wanted to survive, they had to learn how to identify all kinds of spiritual items from a young age. In the process of harvesting spiritual items, they had to fight demon beasts. Therefore, in terms of bravery and bloodthirstiness, the people of the northern frontier didn't lose to the people of the Frost Mirror grassland. Most of the people following Li Zhongxing were veterans of the southern expedition who had been trained from the northern frontier. The remaining veterans were also the first troops to follow Li Zhongxing. All of them had lived in the extreme north of the Shenwu dynasty. Facing the dangers of survival day after day had never moved these men. Was the Shuangjin dynasty trying to scare them by sending their cavalry in that direction? Hearing the incessant shouts of killing, Kei Shen felt a buzzing in his head. He didn't know where he got his quick wits from, but he gritted his teeth and roared, Marshal Li, I have to admit that your troops are brave, but as the marshal, aren't you being a little too reckless? The enemy of the northern frontier isn't the Shuangjin dynasty, but the Shenwu dynasty across the river. Li Zhongxing slowly raised his right hand. Only then did the shouts of killing stop. Gulp. Kei Shen swallowed, feeling his throat dry. He continued, I think, whether it's the king of the northern frontier or the Dragon King, neither of them wants to face the Shuangjin dynasty's troops while fighting the Shenwu dynasty, right? Continue to bicker with him. Drag it out for as long as you can. In any case, none of the people who invade the northern frontier will live. Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice rang out in Li Zhongxing's mind again. Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He looked at Kei Shen with a kind expression and laughed. Didn't this marshal say that I'm not qualified to speak with the Shuangjin dynasty? This marshal isn't high enough to discuss this matter with the Shuangjin dynasty. If you really want to talk, then let's wait for 2 days and do as His Highness says. Is that all right? Although Kei Shen's expression was unsightly, Li Zhongxing was already pointing a blade at him. He naturally knew that he couldn't go too far. Otherwise, this fellow really wouldn't mind fighting with them. After all, the northern frontier's current thinking was that they were protecting their country. The responsibility of starting a war didn't even fall on them. But if they fought, the merits would be theirs. Kei Shen nodded with some difficulty and said helplessly, everyone, let's both take a step back. Before we reach an agreement, we won't ask you to release our brothers trapped in the northern frontier, but we ask that you provide them with supplies. Chen Zifang sneered and said to the general next to him, Hey, Li Zhen, have you ever heard of a burglar breaking into your home and then having to provide him with food and water after holding him down with great difficulty? Never heard of it. Like his name, Li Jun looked burly and powerful, but he had a sharpness that didn't match his appearance. He didn't hesitate to cooperate with Chen Zifang and said with a smile, "In my hometown, when you catch a burglar, you don't even need to send him to the officials. Just beat him to death." Kei Shen's expression darkened as he looked at Chen Zifang and Li Zhongsheng. Before he could say, "I've tolerated you for a long time," he felt Li Zhongsheng's blade getting closer to his neck. He could only bitterly say, "I know this request is a bit excessive, but those brothers can't just eat and drink, can they?" Since Marshal Li also believes that this is a misunderstanding, why should we expand the conflict? If it really doesn't work, we can just send supplies to those brothers inside. Is that not enough? Li Zhongsheng lightly shook his head and said with a cold face, "Before His Highness's decree, your troops are not allowed to advance an inch. Otherwise, we will treat it as a declaration of war." At this point, Li Zhongsheng glanced at the smiling Chen Zifang. Seeing that the latter was slowly becoming serious, he said in a low voice, "But your troops can give the prepared supplies to me. I will arrange for people to send them to the rear." Kei Shen's brows furrowed and he couldn't make up his mind. Chapter 507. In the end, Kei Ting chose to give in and agreed to send the supplies to the Southern Expedition's camp. However, he also proposed to send some cavalry with good cultivation to transport the supplies. Firstly, he wanted to ensure that these supplies would not be used to support the enemy. Even if the Southern Expedition wanted to take these supplies, they might not be able to kill all the cavalry. If one or two escaped, the two sides might go to war. The consequences were not something Li Zhongsheng could bear. Secondly, he wanted to see for himself the condition of the grassland warriors who had lost contact with the Shuangjin dynasty and see if they were still worth saving. After all, they were now asking for peace with the northern frontier. This was equivalent to exchanging real money for the warriors trapped in the northern frontier. It was similar to the trade of people within the Shuangjin dynasty. The attitude of the northern frontier was obvious. Kei Ting did not think that the northern frontier's appetite would be small. Even the extremely wealthy Bloodbath tribe would have to fork out a huge sum of money to exchange for the Frost Mirror cavalrymen, not to mention the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to. According to the rules, the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to would have to pay at least 40% of the cost. If this amount of wealth was distributed to the various smaller tribes, it would be an astronomical sum that would suffocate them. Although the Frost Mirror grassland did not lack resources, due to the special living environment, they did not only trade animal meat, spiritual items, and other goods that were widely circulated everywhere. The extra people would also be treated as trade goods. If their own tribe could not afford to raise them, they would be sold to other tribes that had more resources but fewer people. As for their status, it was not a problem that the original tribe had to worry about. As for the remnants of a defeated army, they were clearly not worth the Mirror Frost dynasty's investment. How cruel. The corners of Li Zhongsheng's mouth twitched slightly. His eyes were somewhat hazy. As a future top military officer of the Shenwu dynasty, he naturally knew what Kei Ting's actions meant. However, this did not mean that he could understand Frost Mirror's barbaric actions. In his opinion, if his fellow soldiers and comrades had fallen into such a situation, he would choose to save those who might still be alive no matter what the price was. He would also try his best to send the bodies of the dead back to their hometown for a proper burial. Unlike Frost Mirror Man, who regarded his compatriots as a resource and only traded with them when he could gain benefits from it, Frost Mirror Man did. If they were in the same predicament one day, would they be disgusted by their fellow soldiers' actions? After Kei Ting left the camp, Li Zhongsheng waved his hand and dismissed all the generals and staff officers in the commander's tent. In order to prevent a troop from becoming the personal army of the commander, Li Zhong carefully divided each troop into different battalions. Every 10,000 men could form a battalion, and each battalion had a battalion commander, a deputy commander, and 3 staff officers. Including the mid-level and low-level officers, any battalion of the 3 armies of the northern frontier could almost snowball into a huge army without falling into chaos. Although the battalion commanders and deputy battalions were all outstanding graduates of the military school of the Northern Frontier Academy, their backgrounds were completely different. Some were grassroots generals promoted by Lin Yuan from poor families, while others were descendants of aristocratic families who had submitted to Lin Yuan. As for the staff officers, one was from the Demon Emperor Association, while the other two were guests of Li Zhongsheng and Qinhu of the Genie Guards. It could be said that each faction was stuffed into a battalion to check and balance each other. No matter what the characters and abilities of these people were, they all had their own factions behind them. Naturally, it was impossible for them to get along well. After all, everyone had their own interests. Only very few people would believe in feelings and loyalty. Of course, in order to prevent each faction from harming their comrades for their own interests, Li Zhongsheng also adopted a system of punishment. For example, once disobeying orders, the battalion commander, deputy battalion commander, and 3 staff officers would not be able to escape. It was fine if it was impossible, but if anyone was determined to drag down the northern frontier, before facing the anger of Lin Yuan and Li Zhongsheng, they would still have to wrestle with the other 4 big shots. Unless all 5 of them were determined to betray the northern frontier, just the difference in strength alone was enough to send those disloyal fellows to hell. It was also because of this system of appointment that although Li Zhongxing was nominally the commander of the southern expedition and could mobilize any unit, he could only give a general strategy and detailed battle objectives. The degree of completion and the plan of completion were all discussed by his subordinates. If K. Ting had not come to the meeting as an emissary of the Shuangjin dynasty, the northern frontier generals and staff officers would never have gathered in Li Zhongxing's tent. Now that the meeting was over, even if Li Zhongxing did not ask them to leave, they would not stay here for long. After all, no one knew when the war would start. If they had the time to chat here, they might as well go back and sharpen their weapons. Dragon King, I'm not doubting you, but I feel that your way of doing things is no different from playing with fire. After everyone had left, Li Zhongxing casually threw his saber to the side and sat down on his tiger-skin chair. He said in a deep voice, "Since you don't intend to negotiate with these barbarians, you shouldn't keep them in suspense. Now that things have come to this, it's really not easy to end things." Lin Yuan's projection slowly condensed in Li Zhongxing's commander's tent. A cold glint flashed in his different-colored eyes as he sneered, "I want to use the fate of these barbarians to tell everyone that no matter what schemes they have behind the scenes, if they don't have the determination to fight to the death with the northern frontier, don't interfere. Otherwise, this king will directly chop off their hands. Do you think it's better to settle things once and for all, or to drag things out slowly?" At this point, Lin Yuan paused for a moment and said, "The Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce has indeed brought in a lot of profits. Before this, it could almost support the simultaneous operation of several projects. But after the war started, 2/3 of the reform and construction projects in the northern frontier were suspended, and all the money squeezed out was used to fund the various troops. Because of this, the various departments still owe the soldiers their salaries. Although the equipment from the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of War has been equipped with all of you, they have only paid you a portion of the cost of the materials. They still haven't paid you the labor fees and salaries." A string of black lines slowly appeared on Li Zhongxing's forehead. Of course, he knew that war cost money, and a lot of it at that. For example, the Shenwu dynasty had been peaceful for decades. Even if the officials were greedy, the treasury was still considered rich. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Lei Qiusheng slept on a mountain of gold every day. But how long had it been since the war on four fronts started? The treasury of the Shenwu dynasty had basically been emptied. Chapter 508. After all, you're a general now. You can't think in such a simple way. Theoretically, I should only pay you the salary of the South Expedition Army. Actually, you should be concerned about the expenses and rations of the surrendered troops and captives. However, I still paid the bill for you. As of now, your South Expedition Army is growing larger and larger in scale. Did I tell you to stop? Lin Yuan sat up and said calmly, "Anyway, I don't want to fight the Shenwu dynasty and the Shuangjin dynasty slowly. If you want to let these people go, you will have to fight at the front when the Frost Mirror Barbarian invades next time. Also, don't expect me to pay you a single cent outside of the establishment." The corner of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. He held back the swear words that were about to come out of his mouth. He didn't have the national treasury of the Shinwu dynasty that had been peaceful for decades, nor did he have the terrifying beast that was the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. If he had to support an army of millions of people, wouldn't that be asking for his life? But Lin Yuan's attitude was very clear. He didn't want to fight this war. Whoever wanted to fight would pay. Li Zhongxing wanted to complain about this kind of rascal behavior, but he didn't know how to say it. After all, the Southern Expedition's military strength was several times greater than the establishment that Lin Yuan had given him. And as the work of cleaning up the Northern Territory continued, this number was still increasing. When the war was over, they would definitely be dealt with. But Li Zhongxing didn't want to be forced into a dead end because of this matter. Then if all 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian soldiers are lost at the northern frontier, how should we deal with it? Now that the Shuangjin dynasty has taken the initiative to beg for peace with us, it seems that they are prepared to bleed a lot. But not only did the Dragon King not give them face, his actions are no different from starting a war. If they really go to war regardless of everything, it will be no less than a disaster for our northern frontier. Li Zhongxing cupped his fist at Lin Yuan and said in a deep voice, "Am I right?" Li Zhongxing, who was disgusted by Lei Qiusheng's action of abandoning the people in the Northern Territory, couldn't tolerate sand in his eyes now, especially after experiencing the good life of the people in the northern frontier. Li Zhongxing couldn't be said to be loyal to anyone now. The only thing he wanted to protect was the people in the northern frontier who had sacrificed everything for their livelihood. Lin Yuan said that he wasn't willing to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty, but at the same time, he was provoking the Shuangjin dynasty. He couldn't figure out the meaning behind this at all, so he could only look at Lin Yuan with a confused gaze, hoping to get an answer. If Lin Yuan really decided to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the critical juncture where the Shinwu dynasty was about to launch a counterattack against the northern frontier, then Li Zhongxing would summon those loyal to him to launch a military remonstrance even if it meant risking his life, forcing Lin Yuan to give up this bold idea that shouldn't have existed. The northern frontier alone was enough for them to digest for a long time. Not to mention that Lei Qiusheng still had the strength to spare. Even if he could kill Lei Qiusheng in one blow, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take down the remaining central plains and southern territories. So Li Zhongxing is right. You still have room for improvement in strategy, but in terms of strategy, you're just a chicken. Lin Yuan looked at Li Zhongxing with pity, helplessly shaking his head, and explained, "Right now, we're not the ones fighting a war. I'd rather use these military funds to develop the northern frontier and even the entire northern territory than waste them on such meaningless things. You're also one of the people with the highest status in the northern frontier. You should know how much work we still have to do and how much resources we lack." Hearing this, although Li Zhongxing didn't like the way Lin Yuan looked at him like he was an idiot, he still nodded to show his agreement. If Lin Yuan really was a warmonger, he wouldn't waste time researching the new laws of the northern frontier. He also wouldn't exterminate the sects and then punish the noble families. He also wouldn't take all the land in the northern frontier and rent it to the people for farming at a very low price. At the same time, he would establish the Northern Frontier Academy and a series of huge projects related to people's livelihood, medical care, and other fields. Just by relying on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, it wasn't impossible for Lin Yuan to cultivate the northern frontier into a war-loving land where everyone was a soldier. However, Lin Yuan's choice was to slowly develop and gradually reform. Every move might not be beneficial at the moment, but it would definitely be beneficial for the future. If there were really so many resources that he didn't have any place to use them, Lin Yuan would definitely carry out more projects and build more gathering places so that every inch of land in the northern frontier could be used properly. He wouldn't train an army to compete with the Shinwu dynasty. Although it looked like Lin Yuan made the first move, in reality, Lin Yuan's purge of the northern frontier was Lei Qiusheng's idea. The situation had developed to this point because Lei Qiusheng didn't want Lin Yuan to easily take over the northern frontier. It would be best if he acted like a tool and wiped out the rebellion in the northern frontier. After forcing the southern frontier to make a move, he would obediently retreat to his own northern frontier. However, Lei Qiusheng wasn't the only tyrannical person in this world. Lin Yuan, who was able to come up with God's mandate and King's law, was no less tyrannical than Lei Qiusheng. However, Lei Qiusheng didn't have the boldness to lie by the side of the bed and allow others to sleep soundly. From the beginning, he only wanted to use the northern frontier as a test subject for the reform, so that the hostility of those aristocratic families and sects would be transferred to us. However, now that the northern frontier is strong, Lei Qiusheng can no longer let us continue to grow. Once we take over the northern frontier, the speed of our development will definitely rise to another level. At that time, the extremely weak Shenwu dynasty might not be able to be destroyed at any moment, but the outcome would already be determined. Therefore, the battle between the Shenwu dynasty and the northern frontier will happen sooner or later. It's just a matter of waiting for us to be fully prepared before attacking, or Lei Qiusheng taking advantage of the fact that we haven't stabilized our footing yet. For an outstanding military strategist like me, Lei Qiusheng's actions weren't out of my expectations. On the contrary, I didn't expect the Shenwu dynasty to be so weak. Therefore, I'm more and more worried about what kind of trump card he has in his hands. Under these circumstances, our own wishes don't matter at all. Right now, the Reflection Frost dynasty has changed their ways and is humbly begging for peace with us. It's not because of the reasons they've given us, but simply because they don't want to fight. Therefore, whether we teach them a lesson or not, they won't fight. Or rather, they won't choose to fight to the death with us right now. Do you think they will be grateful to us if we let those barbarians go? Lin Yuan's eyes flickered with an obscure brilliance. It was as if he was looking at the Frost Mirror Khan from countless miles away and seeing through his heart. His tone was even more certain than guessing. Chapter 509. Isn't that the case? Li Zhongsheng's eyes widened. If all 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen are killed, it'll be a blood feud. Those barbarians will never let it go. They'll have to go to war eventually. Your actions will definitely bring the war forward. Li Zhongsheng felt that the more he listened, the more confused he became. It seemed that Lin Yuan was right, but his reason told him that this was all sophistry. Lin Yuan definitely had other plans behind his back. After such a huge feud, even if Frost Mirror Khan didn't want to go to war with Lin Yuan, those tribes would definitely force him to send troops to the northern frontier. After all, only some of them were unlucky now. Once the war started, the northern frontier and the whole Shuangjin dynasty would be in trouble. Even if it was for the survival of their own tribes, most of them would choose to go to war. Frost Mirror Khan is like a wolf. Before they're full, they'll keep following you. When you show a weakness, they'll pounce on you and tear your flesh apart to fill their stomach. If you don't want to, you can only raise your weapons and beat them until they're scared. Only then will they tuck their tails between their legs and show their more dog-like side. They'll stay away from you and won't dare to provoke you for a while. If we show weakness now, the Shuangjin dynasty won't be grateful to us. Instead, they'll think that the northern frontier is only strong on the outside but weak on the inside. After they've healed their wounds, the first thing they'll do is to invade our territory and burn, kill, and pillage. By then, it'll be an endless war. Mirrorfrost had fallen into Lei Qiusheng's trap. Not only were the 700,000 Mirrorfrost cavalrymen trapped in the Central Plains unable to come out, even more Mirrorfrost cavalrymen would be trapped in this deadly trap. Based on this battle alone, I am certain that at least half of the Shuangjin dynasty's border army near the Shenwu dynasty will be destroyed. Apart from the border army, the tribes near the Shenwu dynasty will also lose many young and strong men. Of course, we weren't the only ones who knew that Lei Qiusheng's concession was a trap. The Shuangjin dynasty knew it too. The reason they wanted to make peace with us was to preserve their strength as much as possible so that they wouldn't lose too much of their strength. They might even lose the edge of the Frost Mirror grassland so that their ranch could become our hunting ground. If both sides worked together and the beast hide in the Hengduan mountain range, the Shuangjin dynasty might not even be able to recover from the setback. Speaking of which, if we can't determine the victor between us and Lei Qiusheng, then we need a way out. Therefore, the Shuangjin dynasty's invasion this time is a way for us to ease our relationship. At that time, we can choose to call a truce and head north together to collect this debt of blood from the Shuangjin dynasty. Then, we can return to our respective territories and start accumulating strength for the next war. But this time, if we sign a truce, we won't have an excuse to head north to attack the Frost Mirror grassland. Naturally, we can't join forces to attack the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if we shamelessly call a truce, the other dynasties won't just stand by and watch us attack the Shuangjin dynasty. If they cut off the trade with the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, we won't even have a place to cry. So, they only need to withstand the pressure from Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled. I don't want the northern frontier to fall into a two-sided war. I just want to tell these barbarians one thing: the northern frontier will never back down from a fight. As long as they want to fight, I'll fight with them. Plus, there's a special tribal system there. Before we can catch our breath, Shuangjin Khan's throne will probably change hands. Do you think that Shuangjin Khan, who has dominated the grassland for 50 years, will do such a profitable business for a bunch of dead people? This, Li Zhongxing's eyes widened even more. He said with a puzzled expression, since the Shuangjin dynasty has already seen through the trap, won't they know to withdraw and wait for the right opportunity? They'll attack us when we fight with Lei Qiusheng. No matter who they help, or whether they fight on both sides, they'll still benefit from it. That's what we need to do. Fan the flames, add oil, let this fire burn even more fiercely. Let the Shuangjin dynasty suffer the greatest loss and force them to swallow their anger. The coldness in Lin Yuan's eyes slowly faded and turned into an obscure emotion. I'm slow-witted. I don't understand what the Dragon King means. Li Zhongxing shook his head with a bitter smile. However, he was sharp enough to smell the blood in Lin Yuan's words. In the end, weren't they still going to fight? Sophistry indeed. The loss of 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian is not an unacceptable loss for the Shuangjin dynasty, because the number of young men who die from the cold, starvation, or being killed by demon beasts on the grassland is far more than that. However, for some tribes, the loss of these young men is a disaster. They won't accept this result easily, so they'll do everything they can to recoup their losses. For example, 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian died on the northern frontier, but 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian killed and looted as they pleased in the Central Plains. If they want to recoup their losses, do you think it's better to start a war with the northern frontier, or go to the Central Plains, where they think it's incomparably prosperous, and even plunder for a while more in the south? If we show enough strength, the Shuangjin barbarian will wisely choose to avoid us and hold this grudge in their hearts for the time being. However, in the current situation, their first choice is still to plunder the Shenwu dynasty. This wise decision is what both Lei Qiusheng and I want to see. The only ones who want to stop them are the higher-ups of the Shuangjin dynasty. However, the tribes that have suffered losses won't let go of such a good opportunity, especially the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of Frost Mirror Khan's influence. Even if they pretend to be obedient, they won't let go of such a fat piece of meat like the Shenwu dynasty. Lin Yuan's voice trembled as he said, Lei Qiusheng used the bones of countless people to build a path to victory for himself. In this aspect, he's even more of a bloodthirsty demon beast than this king. But you also said that the Shuangjin dynasty already knows that this is a trap. Before Li Zhongxing could finish his words, his face turned pale and he swallowed dryly. He suddenly realized that Lin Yuan, this demon beast, knew more about the situation of the various factions than he, a professionally trained officer, did. The unique tribal system of the Shuangjin dynasty was no different from that of the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range. However, the beast Lord Kirin could intimidate countless demon beasts, but the old Frost Mirror Khan didn't have such strength. Although he was revered as the king of the grassland, the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of the Blood Liao tribe's influence had never obeyed Frost Mirror Khan's orders. Chapter 5:10. The harvest of 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian in the Central Plains was enough to make most of the Frost Mirror tribes jealous. It was also enough to drive the tribes that had suffered heavy losses crazy. Even if the Frost Mirror Khan ordered them not to enter the Shinwu dynasty's territory, they wouldn't listen. Lin Yuan's act of killing 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian was equivalent to pouring oil on Lei Qiusheng's trap. The fire that wasn't strong enough to begin with instantly engulfed more than half of the Frost Mirror grassland. And this was an overt scheme. Unless the Shuangjin dynasty was willing to start an all-out war with the northern frontier, they could only choose the seemingly weak Shinwu dynasty. This king isn't as ruthless as Lei Qiusheng, but this king loves his own people more than Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan finally regained his composure and said with a smile, "No one knows what Lei Qiusheng's trump card is. This king doesn't want him to use it on the northern frontier. It's better to send him more Frost Mirror Barbarian. When he can't hold on anymore, he'll naturally reveal his trump card in advance. I know what to do." Li Zhongxing nodded with a serious expression. No one knew what Lei Qiusheng's trump card was, but in this situation, unless Lei Qiusheng went crazy, he definitely had something that could change the situation in an instant. Letting Lei Qiusheng use this thing on the Shuangjin barbarian was obviously much better than using it on the northern frontier. Although he didn't like this kind of scheme, it wasn't his own doing. However, this wasn't his doing, and it was indeed for the sake of the entire northern region. Therefore, even if Li Zhongxing didn't like it, he could only persuade himself to accept and even obey. The next morning, Kai Yan led 30 Shuel Yao cavalry and 200+ carriages of supplies, his face solemn as he arrived at the Southern Expedition's scouting area. After yesterday's meeting, Li Zhongxing had no intention of stopping him. Very quickly, he led the 5,000 light cavalry to the front of the formation. Marshal Li looks a lot more energetic. Kai Fan rubbed her hands together. She had dark circles under her eyes, and it was obvious that she hadn't rested well. In fact, Li Zhongxing had also gone through a lot of mental struggles last night. But after thinking it over, she still decided that Lin Yuan's actions were the most beneficial for the northern frontier. It was also the best way to break Lei Qiusheng's trap. At the very least, it was the method with the least losses. So, for the latter half of the night, Li Zhongxing didn't continue to brainstorm with herself and fell asleep peacefully. But looking at Kai Yan's appearance, Lei Qiusheng knew that this young clan leader of the Green Fish tribe didn't have a good time after returning home yesterday. The arrogant and unreasonable Shuangjin dynasty had lowered their proud heads, but they didn't get the respect they deserved from the northern frontier. The situation they were facing was completely different from what they had expected. Not only did the northern frontier not show the slightest bit of fear, they even seemed to be full of fighting spirit. But even if the northern frontier wanted to fight, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't. They only wanted to preserve their strength and wait until the northern frontier and the Shinwu dynasty had a decisive battle before coming to take advantage of the situation. There was no need for them to help that bastard Lei Qiusheng fight the vanguard after falling into his trap. At least, that was what the generals of the Shuangjin dynasty convinced themselves. But according to Kai Yan's report, the northern frontier didn't plan to release the captives immediately. They wanted to send the message back and wait for the reply from the northern frontier prince's mansion before deciding on their next move. Before that, they couldn't even send their supply wagons past the southern expedition's position. They could only send some cavalry to accompany the southern expedition to transport the wagons. In the words of those scholars, the behavior of the northern frontier was no different from being shameless when they were given face. But they couldn't do anything because, just as Lin Yuan had predicted, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't plan to fight this battle. So, they could only vent their anger on Kai Yan, the envoy. As a result, Kai Yan looked like he was going to collapse at any moment. Li Zhongxing glanced at Kai Yan and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I didn't expect young clan leader to be so knowledgeable about the situation of our brothers trapped in the northern frontier. 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers wasn't a small number. These 200 wagons of supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between their teeth." Although the defense line of the northern frontier wasn't that tight, the intelligence network formed by the Association of the Demon Emperor's members and the embroidered uniform guards wasn't something that the Shuangjin dynasty could infiltrate. So, the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers who were still defending the plains definitely hadn't made contact with the main forces. So, Kei Yan's 200 wagons of supplies were just a pretense. At the same time, it was also to express his distrust of the northern frontier. Kei Yan smiled helplessly and wiped the sweat on his forehead. He said with an apologetic smile, "Marshal Li must be joking. Just by looking at your southern expedition, I know that the northern frontier's army isn't ordinary. We know our own strength. How could those good-for-nothings be a match for your northern frontier's army? Let alone 500,000, even if they had 200,000 left, they would be burning incense to thank the gods." At this point, Keijua paused for a moment before continuing, "We're just going to take a look at the situation today. Although the supplies we brought are better than nothing, they should be able to last for half a day. Once we confirm the situation, we'll be able to make preparations." Li Zhongxing expressionlessly pulled on the reins and turned his horse around. He said coldly, "I'll say the ugly words first. Your cavalry had better behave themselves. If they do anything inappropriate, I have the right to kill them on the spot. Also, after confirming the situation, you can prepare for the next shipment, but all of your cavalry will have to come back with you. Do you understand this?" "Understand my ass?" Kei Yan's face suddenly darkened. He didn't expect Li Zhongxing's slap to come so quickly and so suddenly. They had prepared such a small amount of supplies in order to annoy Li Zhongxing and make his men make a few more trips. Of course, there was no lack of distrust in Li Zhongxing. They were worried that the southern expedition would seize too much of the supplies, which would be considered an act of aiding the enemy. But Li Zhongxing's attitude was also very clear: "You don't trust me, and I don't trust you. You think I'll seize your supplies? I think you're using this method to increase your troops." But then again, both sides were just trying to annoy each other. They didn't really suspect each other of doing anything. After all, the supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between Li Zhongxing's teeth. Even if Li Zhongxing seized them, they would only be able to fill the gaps between their teeth. With the troops around him, they could eat all 200 carriages of supplies in 1 or 2 meals. Although the dozens of cavalry were all in the late stage of the airborne realm, such a small number of people was definitely not enough to increase the number of troops. What was the difference between increasing the number of troops in such a scale and sending them to their deaths? Chapter 5:11. "Marshal, what should we do with the Frost Mirror cavalry that came with us?" A light rider rode up to Li Zhongxing, a faint murderous intent flashing across his fair face. The fair-skinned young general was a graduate of Qiao Yu's batch. However, unlike Qiao Yu, who was known as Black Bear due to his simple and honest nature, Qiao Yu was known as the Black Bear, which made him the type of general who would charge and break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the fair-skinned young general, Zhang Xiuzhu, was more of a scholarly general. His training was decent as well, having reached the pinnacle of the airborne realm before the age of 30. He was only one step away from reaching the celestial star realm. Li Zhongxing was also one of the military mentors of the Northern Frontier Academy. Qiao Yu and Zhang Xiuzhu were both students that he thought highly of. Although they had their own shortcomings and were not as good as Qin Yu and Zhao Guangchong, who were taught by Lin Yuan and were able to lead troops to the south as soon as they graduated, he still wanted to get closer to Li Zhongxing. To be fair, Zhang Xiuzhu was not worse than the students taught by Lin Yuan. He could become a famous general after some training. However, his biggest weakness was hatred. Zhang Xiuzhu's parents were both civilians. They did not even have the ability to move to other places to live, let alone have the ability to cultivate. Therefore, every year when the Frost Mirror barbarian raided the border, Zhang Xiuzhu and his parents could only rely on luck to avoid being killed. However, luck would always run out. When Zhang Xiuzhu was 7 years old, the Shuangjin dynasty raided the border. His parents were killed by the sword, and only the young Zhang Xiuzhu escaped by hiding in a secret cellar at home. Since then, the seed of hatred had been planted in Zhang Xiuzhu's heart. Lin Yuan set up the Northern Frontier Academy and supported poor students. This was a great opportunity for Zhang Xiuzhu, and he did show his extraordinary talent. Compared to the children of aristocratic families who grew up with spiritual objects, Zhang Shuzhu, who started cultivating in his 20s, could not achieve much. However, there was no limit to human perseverance and potential. Zhang Shuzhu, who had a blood feud, was far more hardworking than the other students in the same batch. His cultivation, the art of war, and even strategy were all excellent in almost every subject. However, when everyone thought that Zhang Shuzhu could win Lin Yuan's favor and become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, this guy rejected Lin Yuan's olive branch without hesitation and went straight to the main camp of the southern expedition. From Zhang Shuzhu's point of view, it was impossible for the southern expedition army to continue south in a short period of time. However, the cleanup work in the north still had to continue. Apart from those clans that were still stubbornly resisting, the Frost Mirror barbarian cavalry that pillaged the border would be the southern expedition army's main opponent for a very long time. And Zhang Shuzhu was indeed capable. After a series of tests, Li Zhongxing believed that this guy, who was not much younger than him, would become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, even if he rejected the recruitment of the so-called Star General class. Therefore, even though he knew that Zhang Shuzhu was currently on the southern expedition, he would divide the southern expedition in the future and take part of the people to form a new army to wrestle with the Shuangjin barbarian. Li Zhongxing gladly accepted Zhang Shuzhu as his disciple and even trained him as his successor. However, Zhang Shuzhu's performance in the past 2 months had indeed proved that he deserved Li Zhongxing's favor. In response to this proud disciple's question, Li Zhongxing only raised his eyelids and said through secret voice sending, "The Shuangjin dynasty has 35 cavalry with them this time. Apart from the heavy military supplies we have, you can only take 50 people with you. How do you think we should deal with them? Kill them." A cold light bloomed in Zhang Shuzhu's eyes as he replied without hesitation. Li Zhongxing was silent for a while. Zhang Shuzhu scratched the back of his head and said with a smile, "Marshal is not a person who makes arbitrary decisions, but with your authority, it's not impossible for you to let the Shuangjin barbarian go. However, you chose to stall for time without discussing with us. This action already shows that Marshal has no intention of letting those barbarians go. Moreover, you're not the only one who has an opinion on this matter." Haha. Li Zhongxing smiled noncommittally. He just waved his horsewhip gently, indicating for Zhang Shuzhu to leave. Just as Lin Yuan had said, Li Zhongxing was a chicken when it came to strategy. His current actions could only deceive the Shuangjin barbarian. However, those in the southern expedition with discerning eyes could see that Li Zhongxing, who had always followed the advice of others, had chosen to use stalling tactics to cut off the Frost Mirror barbarian's chances of survival. It was obvious that someone was guiding him behind the scenes. And although Li Zhongxing was the king of the northern frontier, he only had the authority to make suggestions. He did not have the authority to directly command the commander-in-chief of the northern frontier's 3 armies. If it was Li Zhongxing's idea, then Li Zhongxing would still have to discuss it with them before deciding whether to do it or not. That was why the entire southern expedition was so quiet. No one argued with Li Zhongxing like Li Zhongxing did with Lin Yuan. The reason was very simple. Most of them were already scared out of their wits by Lin Yuan. Lin Yuan had never tasted defeat since his debut. Therefore, they could not see the depth of Lin Yuan's decision. Even if they could see it clearly, no one would overestimate themselves and ask Lin Yuan to correct it. When Zhang Shuzhu gradually rode away, Li Zhongxing once again said through secret sound transmission, "Just say that it was my idea. Go to that place and pick a group of ruthless people to go with you. First, lead them around in circles. After you have shed all pretense of cordiality, you must do it cleanly. Don't leave any hidden dangers." Speaking up to here, Li Zhongxing paused and smiled. Besides that, Wei River City has been breached, and there are still over 100,000 reserve troops of the Divine Forest Army gathered near Tsangtao City. We can't clear them out for the time being, but we have to let these Frost Mirror barbarians vent their anger, right? This general will not disappoint the Grand Marshal. Zhang Shuzhu pulled on the reins and turned his head to look at Li Zhongxing. His white face squeezed out a bright smile. As for how to use these 200 carriages of supplies to provoke the conflict between the Frost Mirror Barbarian and the Shenlin Jun reserves, he had already outlined a rough plan in his mind. At the same time, he also guessed what Black Jiao, who gave him today's position and opportunity, was planning. Kei Ting stared blankly at the two people's lips moving. He subconsciously felt his heart sink. But when he listened carefully, he could not understand what they were talking about. Although they were speaking the common language of Tianwu continent, the words they spat out were all numbers. For someone like him who did not know the code of the northern frontier, it was no different from listening to a heavenly book. But his keen sense of danger still made him feel that the southern expedition was secretly planning something. Chapter 5:12. Young clan leader, why are you in a daze? Li Zhongxing urged his horse to the side of the hesitant Kei Teng and lightly poked him with the end of his whip. Only then did Kei Teng wake up from his deep thoughts. His entire body seemed to have been startled, and cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. That was my favorite student, but his personality is a little weird. He doesn't know how to speak the common language of the Sky Martial continent, so we were using a special secret signal to communicate. I told him to go back and pick 50 capable brothers to escort you on this trip. Is there any problem on your side? Kei Ting finally calmed down. When he looked at Li Zhongxing again, he discovered that he was smiling warmly. Gently shaking his head, Kei Ting forced himself to calm down and said, "But I heard that the northern frontier isn't very peaceful right now. Can 50 people really escort the supplies safely to the destination? Why don't we discuss it again and have both sides send more people?" When he heard the number 50 people, the stone in Kei Ting's heart slowly fell. After all, the cavalry of the northern frontier couldn't be compared to the cavalry of the Shuangjin dynasty. Even the horses they rode were inferior warhorses bought from the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if their cultivation was higher, 50 people against 35 people might not have more than a 50% chance of victory. And even if they could defeat them, it was impossible to keep all 35 of them at the northern frontier. As long as one or two escaped, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take it. Even Kei Teng, who had always believed in his intuition, felt that he was being too cautious, and even a little oversensitive. Li Zhongxing lightly shook his head and bitterly smiled. To be honest, although there are many hidden dangers in the northern frontier, the real threat is the Frost Mirror Cavalry and Shenlin Jun's reservists that we couldn't completely eliminate. With your people here, even if we bump into the Frost Mirror Cavalry, they won't do anything. And if we encounter those reservists, even 2,000 people won't be able to do anything. But if the number of people is smaller, the target will naturally be smaller, and it will be much safer. Kei Ting stared blankly at Li Zhongxing. Shenlin Jun was the trump card of the Shenwu dynasty, and was also the trump card of Lei Qiusheng's dragon throne. Even the reservists were quite a formidable existence. Furthermore, Wei River City, which was known as the Impregnable Fortress, was also a famous existence. But now? The reserve force of the Divine Forest Army had been defeated and even Wei River City had been breached. What kind of monsters were these people? Thinking of this, Kei Ting's last trace of hostility towards the northern frontier completely dissipated. He bitterly smiled and said, "If that's the case, then we'll do as the Grand Marshal wishes. I'll go inform them to prepare to depart." Although the men of the Shuangjin dynasty didn't lack courage and bravery, the special living environment still made them have the personalities of wolves and dogs. Just as Lin Yuan predicted, the stronger the northern frontier displayed, the more the Shuangjin dynasty didn't want to provoke the northern frontier. But Kei Teng, who was just about to leave, suddenly remembered something. He abruptly pulled on the reins and said, "Our 13th prince was deceived by the Shenwu dynasty some time ago and led his troops into the northern frontier's territory by mistake. It's been almost half a month since then. I wonder if our 13th prince is a guest at your residence?" Although the third prince speculated that the 13th prince was dead, the proud Shuang Jianren didn't think so. In their eyes, the northern frontier was just a group of nouveau riche. They might not even be able to withstand the counterattack of the Shenwu dynasty. How could they offend the Shuangjin dynasty at this time? Therefore, even if the 13th prince went on a killing spree in the northern frontier, he only needed to announce his identity after he was defeated. Not only would the northern frontier not dare to touch him, they would even treat him as a guest of honor and wait for the Shuangjin dynasty to take him away. Young master, you must be joking. I haven't heard any news about the 13th prince. The warm smile on Li Zhongxing's face instantly disappeared. He said coldly, I will write another letter to ask the northern frontier's residents. However, I advise you not to have any delusions about this matter. You know our Dragon King's personality. The Shuangjin dynasty has sent troops to invade the northern frontier one after another. If they don't pay a price, they will lose face. This, Keiting originally thought that taking the 13th prince out was just a matter of convenience. After all, they could let the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians go. If they let a few more people go, they wouldn't be criticized. However, Li Zhongxing's cold attitude was telling him to stop dreaming. The Shuangjin dynasty would definitely pay a price for these two invasions. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and the 13th prince, he could only choose one. I still have military matters to attend to. Farewell. Without waiting for Kei Yen to quibble, Li Zhongxing cupped his fists and urged his horse to rush towards the army camp. He's trying to sow discord. When Li Zhongxing disappeared from sight, Keiting threw the horsewhip in his hand to the ground. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians and the 13th prince, this was a choice that even a child could make. However, when it came to Keiting, he couldn't make up his mind. Not to mention that among the 500,000 cavalrymen trapped in the north, at least 60,000 of them were Green Fish clan's disciples. The other clans who had lost some of their men were all hoping that their men could return safely. Because of this matter, Keiting, the envoy, was treated with great respect. Gifts that Keiting didn't even dare to think about before were prepared and sent directly to his tent. There were even some tribes that used beauty traps. Their goal was to make Keiting protect as many of their tribe's men as possible. Once Jueqi gave up on the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian cavalrymen and chose to bring the 13th prince back to the imperial court, he would be tied to the Blood Liao tribe. Once the Blood Liao tribe collapsed, there would be no place for the Green Fish tribe to stay in the prairie. If Kan Shuang had been young, it would have been fine. Unfortunately, Kan Shuang had been seriously injured when he was young. His cultivation had not improved in the past few years, and his body was deteriorating day by day. There was no telling when he would pass away. Although there were many outstanding princes in the Shuoliao tribe, the most outstanding ones were the 3rd and 13th princes. Of the two of them, one was a scholar and one was a martial artist. If these two forces could not be merged together, the decline of the Bloodstream tribe would be inevitable. But from what he knew, the relationship between the 3rd prince and the 13th prince could be said to be irreconcilable. However, if Keiting chose the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and gave up on the 13th prince, then what awaited him would be the fury of the Bloodspan tribe. Those tribes wouldn't care about his friendship. In the eyes of the prairie people, they had already prepared a generous gift for Keiting. Keiting bringing back their tribe's young men safely was his duty. Only a fool would fall out with the Bloodstream tribe in order to protect Keiting. Chapter 513. Xinwu Dynasty, Imperial Capital. Lei Qiusheng paced back and forth in Yangxin Palace with his hands behind his back. He glanced around the empty palace with a gloomy face. The entire Yangxin Palace was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Anyone who got close to the palace would find it hard to breathe. Lei Qiusheng's plan had only begun to work now. After opening up the borders, the border army under his command retreated to the Central Plains. Although they might not be able to confront the Frost Mirror cavalry head-on, they could still defend the imperial city and the nearby cities. Before the war began, Lei Qiusheng had already ensured his own safety. However, the northern frontier did not have such a good condition. The northern battlefront army was still in the north. Most of the soldiers in the southern battlefront army were new recruits. Even the old soldiers were just average. They were much weaker than the elite soldiers in the border army. The only force that could give him pressure was the fallen star army that Yan Xingqi had trained. But the number of soldiers was too small. In a large-scale battle where more than 1 million soldiers were involved, what could 5,000 soldiers do to him? Lei Qiusheng could never imagine that any army in the northern frontier could fight the Shuangjin barbarians' main force head-on. Therefore, when he knew that the Shuangjin dynasty was approaching Donglin city, Lei Qiusheng was so excited. He wanted the Shuangjin dynasty to charge in and destroy the entire northern frontier. Then, he could clean up the mess. However, the Shuangjin barbarians stopped. Their main forces didn't act like before, recklessly charging into the northern territories to burn, kill, and plunder. Instead, after encountering the southern expedition army that Lei Qiusheng deemed to be unable to withstand a single blow, they suddenly stopped advancing. Both sides even began to communicate. If the Shuangjin dynasty reached a peace agreement with the northern frontier, it would be a terrible nightmare for him. After all, his trump card was still in the preparation stage. If the northern frontier lost the Shuangjin dynasty's restraint, not only would they be able to quickly annex the entire northern territory, they could even deploy a series of battle plans along the river, waiting for his army to smash their heads and bleed. That's right, his head was broken and bleeding. Although he felt that the army at the northern frontier was mediocre, they were from the Shenwu dynasty and not the Qingjiang dynasty, which had the best navy in the world. Letting his meticulously trained divine marshal heavy steps cross the Wei River to fight was equivalent to throwing iron cans into the Wei River. Who can tell me what the situation is in the north? Without Zhang Xiu, is your embroidered guard all trash? Lei Qiusheng's gaze swept across the shadows of the Hall of Mental Cultivation as he roared angrily. If I had known that the embroidered uniform guard was only at this level, I would have let the Servants' Administration take over the Northern Intelligence Network. Do not challenge this monarch's patience. You must send me the latest intelligence on the north within 4 hours. Furthermore, all of this monarch's orders must be completed with the highest priority. Yes. Understood. As you command. Several feeble voices rang out from the shadows. The embroidered uniform guard's intelligence network in the north had not been disbanded, but due to Lei Qiusheng's suspicious nature, the original officers had all been purged and replaced, regardless of whether they were loyal to him or not. There was no lack of spies that he had personally placed by Zhang Xiu's side. Changing generals at the last minute was a huge taboo in the army. Coupled with Lei Qiusheng's bloody purges, the entire embroidered uniform guard felt insecure. They couldn't even guarantee their own safety, so who would focus on gathering intelligence and establishing a spy network for him? Moreover, in this kind of intelligence network, there were often hundreds or thousands of spies lying dormant in a single command. Only by extending this network could a complete and mature intelligence network be formed. Zhang Xiu had transferred away a group of loyal higher-ups of the embroidered uniform guard, and Lei Qiusheng had purged them himself. Currently, it was unknown how many spies were in contact with the embroidered uniform guard but didn't have official identities. After all, their command lines were already gone. Who could verify their identities? Under such circumstances, the current situation of the embroidered uniform guard wasn't as simple as just rotting away. It was even on the verge of collapse. Lei Qiusheng still had delusions that the embroidered uniform guard could maintain the powerful operational capabilities that it had when Zhang Xiu was still in power. This was no different from a fool's dream. Of course, this kind of intelligence network was different from the military system. At the very least, the bloody purge of the higher-ups had shocked most people. There wouldn't be an army mutiny. As long as there was enough time, the embroidered uniform guard's original structure could definitely be restored. However, if he wanted to restore the all-pervasive scouting ability of the North, he would have to ask the Shifter Emperor Council and the embroidered uniform guard if they were willing to do so. Since you knew it would be so troublesome, why didn't you kill it back then? When I dealt with Zhang Xiu, I had the opportunity to kill it. It was just a matter of convenience. A black shadow flashed, and the shadow that was supposed to be overseeing the south slowly appeared behind Lei Qiusheng. Lei Qiusheng shook his head lightly and said bitterly, "The Black Jiao is indeed a difficult opponent, but it cannot die." At the very least, it cannot die now, and it cannot die at our hands. Oh. The shadow raised its eyebrows imperceptibly, as if it was curious about this statement. With the Black Jiao as the representative of the northern frontier, the Black Jiao has already set its sights on those top powers. Because of the previous incident, the Black Jiao has shown the ambition and ability to replace me. Those top powers are definitely begging for it. Otherwise, why do you think the chaos in the Shenwu dynasty has continued until now? Isn't it just those guys who are creating opportunities for the Black Jiao and stalling for time? In addition, the relationship behind the Black Jiao is also complicated. Forget about the ancient demon court, whose real identity is unknown. Anyway, it can establish a relationship with the top powers. Even if its identity is fabricated, it doesn't matter. However, its current identity is the Lord of the Northern Frontier and the Beast King of the Hengduan Mountains. It is also inextricably linked to those dragon blood demons. All the forces are trying to rope it in. If the Black Jiao dies at this time, not only will the Northern Frontier go out of control, but the Sea Demon Rebellion in the south and the Hengduan Mountains will also take revenge. Even the Frost Mirror Dynasty and the Qingjiang Dynasty will try to take a step further. Lei Qiusheng put his hands behind his back, exhaled a turbid breath, and said in a cold voice, "The Black Jiao was born as a demon beast. This is its natural disadvantage. On the other hand, we are just people who killed our master and usurped the throne. We are not much stronger than it. The other 6 dynasties have been trying to find ways to balance the other forces for so many years. They will not tolerate a usurper like me to continue to exist." Got it. The shadow nodded slightly. He did not understand Lei Qiusheng's thoughts, but as the shadow of Lei Qiusheng, he only needed to obey the order. Chapter 5:14. Forget it. Let's not talk about this. A cold glint flashed across Lei Qiusheng's eyes as he said, "Although the cultists' invasion into the south this time is unexpected, if we use it well, it will be of help. At least the blame won't be directly placed on us. That plan can be started. Once I have a definite order, release them immediately. The south isn't ready yet. Moreover, this is the reason why we fell out with the top powers this time. If we reveal our strength now, it'll be no different from drinking poison to quench our thirst. Although we can resolve the Frost dynasties and the North's problems, the top powers definitely won't tolerate us anymore. In fact, they might even interfere directly with this matter." The shadow took a deep breath and sighed. Moreover, the evil cult's life in the south is not good enough. They are not powerful enough. If we force them to be blamed, it will not be justifiable. There is no other way. Even if we don't want to fall out with those top forces, with their existence, we are no longer on the same side. It is only a matter of time before we fall out with them. Therefore, we don't need to hide anything from them. We just need to explain it to those who have not been in contact with this circle. It is not that I am greedy for power, but after all, the follow-up plan needs a lot of manpower and material resources to be implemented. The Shenwu dynasty can't be given up now. At least, we can't give up before we reach the first stage of the plan." Lei Qiusheng shook his head gently and sighed. "The Shuangjin barbarian now thinks that we are weak and can be bullied. Our previous plan not only failed to suppress the northern frontier, but also shot ourselves in the foot. Should we ask the border army to take action?" The shadow looked serious. "If there are too many Frost Mirror barbarian coming in this time, it will not be good for our recovery. We don't have to go all out. Ask the border army to expand the protection area. We have to protect at least half of the territory in the Central Plains. At the same time, open up a path for Frost Mirror's cavalry to go south. Although those guys are on our side, they are also hungry wolves. Without a large number of blood sacrifices to make them happy, even I can't tell what will happen." Lei Qiusheng's lips curled up slightly as he sneered, "Not long after, the Shenwu dynasty will return to my rule. I can even swallow up half of the Shuangjin dynasty. After recuperating for a few years, I will turn around and swallow up the Qingjiang Empire. When that time comes, I will monopolize half of the world. Who can stop me? Yes. The shadow nodded slightly and disappeared into the shadows again. Although the scheme is good, it's a pity that there will be endless troubles in the future. Lei Qiusheng put his hands behind his back and sighed. If I hadn't been prepared, the Black Jiao would have been in a general's position. Now, it's fine. The more people that come, the happier they will be. No one liked the feeling of being pressured step by step. Even Lei Qiusheng, who had expected this to happen, felt the same way. How could he not know that it was not time for those things to be exposed? If he could use the Shuangjin barbarian to defeat the northern frontier, that would be the best plan. However, with the embroidered uniform guards being replaced and the ether collapsing, not only would the intelligence agencies in the north become dim, but even the intelligence agencies in the south would be dragged into the quagmire of war. In the huge Shenwu dynasty, the only thing that was under his control was the Central Plains, which was run by the Shadow. Therefore, Lin Yuan had schemed under his nose and led a large number of cultists to the south. This was something that he had not expected at all. He had been prepared to use the Shuangjin barbarian as a feint, waiting for the northern frontier to be exhausted before mobilizing the border army to take back the northern territory in one fell swoop. Because of all these arrangements, he could not sit back and watch the south collapse into the hands of the cultists. He could only cooperate with Lin Yuan's rhythm and lead the Frost Mirror Barbarian to the south, letting the barbarians fight with the interest groups in the south. In the hotbed of war, the cultists who preached that they were the representatives of the gods who saved the world would naturally find the best hotbed to grow their strength. Unless the barbarians used the power of the entire dynasty, they would not be able to eliminate the cultists with just a portion of the border army. The difference in strength between the two sides would rapidly shrink and then magnify. When the entire south fell apart, he would use the name of the cultists to release them. Then, he could send all those who held him back or did not listen to him to hell. When they were full, they would naturally be in a good mood. At that time, he would appear and communicate with them. Then, he would put on a show and drive them into the northern frontier or the territory of the Shuangjin dynasty. Not only would he be able to recover his territory, but he would also be able to completely reshuffle the cards and make the bloated dynasty his say in the future. What interest groups in the south? What northern frontier? In the eyes of Lei Qiusheng, they were just a bunch of tools. Ever since he got in touch with them, his vision and structure had long surpassed his own level. Moreover, he had the special existence of the Shadow at his disposal. Naturally, he would be successful in doing things secretly. This time, the four major forces joined forces to attack the Shenwu dynasty because some disobedient fellows among them were discovered. This matter attracted the attention of the top forces, and they asked Lei Qiusheng to release all the restrictions and let them search. However, Lei Qiusheng, who had a guilty conscience, was naturally unwilling to agree. Therefore, the drama of the four forces attacking one was born. Although the top forces didn't have any evidence, those people knew how terrifying they were. Not to mention seeing it, even if it was just a groundless rumor, they would quickly investigate the situation. If there were any signs of something wrong, they would directly kill them. If that fellow hadn't reacted quickly and retreated with them, there would be no survivors in the entire Shenwu dynasty now. According to the original script, Lei Qiusheng would be the biggest loser, and Lin Yuan, Lei Qiusheng, and even the combined forces of the aristocratic families, which were not as powerful as the northern frontier, would become the winners and begin to divide this fat cake. However, among these people who had already gained benefits, except for Lin Yuan, Lei Qiusheng didn't have the intention to put the others in his eyes. His real opponents had always been those high and mighty top forces. At least, this was Lei Qiusheng's plan at the moment. Moreover, the development of the matter was slowly moving in the direction he had envisioned. However, no matter whether it was the reaction of Lin Yuan or the top forces, Lei Qiusheng was an uncontrollable variable. Even if he was lucky enough to make use of the evil cult members introduced by Lin Yuan to talk about the matter, in an attempt to delay the time for the top forces to intervene in this matter, there were several changes in the cards in Lin Yuan's hands that he couldn't figure out in any case. Chapter 5:15. On the northern plains. The Shuangjin dynasty's supply wagons had already set out for quite some distance. Even from the highest watchtower in Donglin City, one could only see a small shadow of the convoy. It wouldn't be long before the convoy completely disappeared from their sight and stepped into the undercurrent of the conflict between the three factions. "How should I address you, General?" Keizhua urged his warhorse to catch up with Zhang Xiuzhu, who was at the front of the group, and asked with a chuckle. Keizhua preferred the 13th prince over the 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen, but he knew very well that no matter which answer he chose, it was the same as choosing death. The only difference was that one would be executed immediately, while the other would be a delayed death. The only way he could find to survive was to find a way to stay on the northern frontier after this matter was over. If things didn't work out, then he would choose the 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen and hide in the northern territories for a period of time. He would return to the plains after the Bloodsill tribe had declined. Even if he lost everything he had now, it was still better than losing his life. At this moment, Kei Ting finally understood why the third prince had given him such a lucrative task, and why the people of the large tribes had mocked him. He hadn't thought much of it when he had received the generous gifts, but now it seemed that these fellows had clearly regarded him as a dead man. If he wanted to survive, he had to curry favor with the northern frontier by hook or by crook in exchange for a period of protection from the northern frontier or a permanent residence on the northern frontier. Because of her nervousness, she urgently needed someone to talk to. Secondly, Keizhua's abilities lay in his cultivation and horseback. If he wanted to make a living after joining the northern frontier, he would have to walk the path of the army. Although Zhang Xiuzhu wasn't conspicuous yet, someone who could gain the favor of Li Zhongxing would definitely have great achievements in the future. That was why he chattered so much in order to make himself known. It could be said that he had put a lot of thought into it. Zhang Xiuzhu glanced at Keizhua and rolled his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have a good impression of the Shuangjin barbarian to begin with. It was already good enough that he didn't draw his sword. Furthermore, Li Zhongxing had set him up as a reclusive person who didn't know how to speak the common language of the Tianwu continent. Under such circumstances, unless he had no other choice, he naturally wouldn't speak. Although these Shuangjin barbarian were already food in his mouth, he wouldn't disregard the big picture for a little personal grudge before he was completely confident. Moreover, it was obvious that Li Zhongxing had reminded him of an opportunity that could bring even greater losses to the barbarians. Why wouldn't Zhang Xiuzhu do it? However, these Shuangjin barbarian couldn't all die in the ambush. At least 2 or 3 Frost Mirror barbarian had to be released before they could return to pass on the news that Li Zhongxing wanted the Shuangjin dynasty to know. The supply convoy had been ambushed by Shenlin Jun's reserve forces, and the convoy was almost completely wiped out. When the time came, Li Zhongxing would take the opportunity to remove the checkpoint and find a way to lead these Shuangjin barbarian to meet the real Shenlin Jun's reserve forces. Including the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian, whose fate was already sealed, Zhang Xiuzhu had to use his great willpower to suppress himself so that he wouldn't laugh out loud. This time, the 49 knights following Zhang Xiuzhu weren't professional soldiers from the northern frontier. Some of them were hired wanderers, and some were cultivators that the Shifter Emperors Association had recruited from the Mercenary Union and the Demon Subduing Masters Association. However, most of them were trained by Luo Su of the Embroidered Uniform Guard. In terms of cultivation, these 49 knights were not inferior to the carefully selected Frost Mirror cavalry generals. Moreover, their past experiences had given them a few more abilities than the Frost Mirror cavalry generals, who rarely moved around in the mountains. In terms of stealth, concealment, and tracking, even if the Frost Mirror cavalry generals had 10 times the number of them, they still wouldn't be able to compete with them in a battlefield that they were familiar with. Therefore, once the situation became chaotic, even if they ran into Shenlin Jun's reserve forces, about 80% of them could survive. If they were lucky, they might even be able to escape from the ambush site with a few survivors. However, Zhang Xiuzhu still needed time to come up with a general plan of action. Although some of the Frost Mirror cavalry generals had to return alive, who would live and who would die was still a matter of consideration. For example, Juechen, who was the messenger, would definitely take up one of the spots. The guy who was wearing an ordinary general's armor but was surrounded by several Frost Mirror cavalry generals probably had a powerful background as well. As for the rest of the spots, Zhang Xiuzhu would have to consider carefully. After all, although the idea of an ambush was proposed by the northern frontier, the scapegoat would definitely be the Shenlin Jun's reserve forces. Therefore, the more people from the Shuangjin dynasty survived, the more credible the rumor that Li Zhongxing spread would be. But similarly, if all the important people survived, and the ones who died were just cavalry generals, the Shuangjin dynasty would naturally become suspicious. They might even take this opportunity to launch a war directly to see the truth of the northern frontier. Therefore, Zhang Xiuzhu needed time and space to observe the situation and determine the status of the Frost Mirror cavalry generals so that he could decide who would survive. According to the plan, the ambushers should be Zhang Xiuzhu's own people who had seized equipment from Wei River City. However, for the sake of realism, once the two sides engaged in close combat, even their own people would not hold back. If they were unlucky or not strong enough, they would die in vain. War had always been this cruel. Moreover, no one knew when the ambush would begin. Therefore, Zhang Xiuzhu's team leader had to arrange everything properly before the ambush happened. For example, he had to arrange at least 3 or 4 people around the valuable Frost Mirror barbarian. Once the battle started and the situation was not good, they would immediately cover the enemy's retreat. After all, they were all on the same side. Once the battlefield was divided, the brothers would not die even if they were captured. In order to ensure the implementation of the plan, Zhang Xiuzhu had even prepared a plan to completely wipe out. Fortunately, the people he brought with him were all elites. They did not have any combat strength or reaction time problems. As long as Zhang Xiuzhu gave the order, or if things deviated from his expectations, they would be able to react immediately. For a scholarly general, like Zhang Xiuzhu, he only needed to be a wise man. Naturally, they would carry out the plan in a way that maximized their benefits. It was just that with Keizhuo constantly chattering in his ear, not to mention that Zhang Xiuzhu's heart-nurturing kung fu had not yet reached the great accomplishment stage, even if he could reach the stage of being indifferent, it would still be difficult for him to ignore Keizhuo, who was like a fly. Helplessly, he could only give an officer next to him a look. You're tuning in to the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.